Picture yourself walking through the morning mist in medieval Europe. The year is 1250, and you're watching something incredible unfold. Smoke rises from hundreds of small villages dotted across rolling green hills. You can hear roosters crowing, children laughing, and the distant sound of a church bell calling people to morning prayers. But what you're seeing isn't just pretty countryside. You're looking at the foundation of everything we know about Western civilization. Here's what's amazing. While we've all heard stories about kings and queens, knights and castles, the real story of medieval life was happening right here, in these humble villages. 9 out of every 10 people during the Middle Ages lived exactly like this. Not in grand palaces, but in simple homes where survival was a daily adventure and community meant everything. Tonight, we're diving deep into their world. We're going to discover how ordinary people created something extraordinary. Communities that lasted for centuries, traditions that still influence us today, and a way of life that was far more sophisticated than most people realize. These weren't primitive folks stumbling around in the Dark Ages. These were smart, resourceful people who figured out how to make life work under conditions that would challenge us today. They survived plagues that killed millions. They weathered famines that would devastate modern cities. They built communities so strong they lasted for hundreds of years. Imagine waking up before sunrise in a medieval village. There's no electricity, no running water, no grocery stores. Everything you eat, you either grow yourself or get from your neighbours. Everyone you trust lives within walking distance. Your survival depends completely on working together with people you've known your entire life. But here's the thing, they didn't just survive, they thrived. They created a world where every season brought its own rhythm, where everyone had a role to play, where celebration and hardship were shared by the whole community. They built something we've largely forgotten how to do, sustainable communities that actually worked. From the moment they opened their eyes at dawn to tend their animals, to the evening hours when families gathered around fires sharing stories passed down through generations, medieval villagers lived according to rhythms we can barely imagine today. No clocks ruled their lives. The sun, the seasons, and the cycles of planting and harvest determined everything. You'll meet the village priest, who was part spiritual guide, part local news anchor, and sometimes the only person who could read and write. There's the miller, who controlled the grain that kept everyone alive, and the wise women who delivered babies and healed the sick using knowledge passed down through generations. We'll walk through their daily routines, how they turned simple ingredients into hearty meals that fed large families, how they made their own clothes from the ground up, and how they celebrated the changing seasons with festivals that brought entire communities together. This is the untold story of how the majority of our ancestors actually lived, not in fairy tale castles, but in real places where every day required intelligence, cooperation, and incredible resilience. It's a story of human ingenuity, community spirit, and the remarkable ability of ordinary people to create extraordinary lives together. Here's why this story matters more than you might think, and why losing this knowledge could be one of the biggest mistakes we make as a society. Right now, we're living through some pretty challenging times. Climate change, social isolation, economic uncertainty. Sound familiar? Well, here's the incredible thing. Medieval villagers dealt with versions of all these problems for hundreds of years, and they not only survived but created thriving communities that were still trying to figure out how to replicate. Think about this for a moment. These people faced catastrophes that would completely destroy our modern world. The Black Death killed 1/3 of Europe's population. Imagine if that happened today. They endured famines that lasted for years. They lived through wars, raids, and natural disasters that would send our civilization into complete chaos. Yet their communities bounced back again and again. What did they know that we've forgotten? They understood something we've lost: how to live sustainably. Not just environmentally, though they did that too, but socially, economically, and spiritually. They created communities where people actually took care of each other, where resources were shared wisely, and where everyone had a meaningful role to play. But we're losing this wisdom at exactly the time we need it most. Every year that passes, we drift further away from understanding how human communities can actually work together for the long term. We live in an age of incredible technology, yet we can't seem to figure out how to maintain strong communities or build sustainable relationships with our environment. Medieval villagers had both of these figured out. Their approach to time itself was revolutionary. Instead of the frantic schedules we live by today, they followed natural rhythms. They planted in spring, celebrated growth in summer, harvested in fall, and used winter for rest and reflection. They understood something we've completely lost: that humans thrive when their lives align with natural cycles rather than fighting against them, and their sense of community. Incredible. They knew that individual success means nothing if your community fails. Taking care of your neighbours wasn't just being nice, it was essential insurance because you knew that someday you might need help too. They had systems of mutual support that kept everyone fed during famines and protected during disasters. We're also losing touch with their incredible practical knowledge. These people were master problem solvers. They figured out how to preserve food for months without refrigeration. They built homes that stayed warm in winter and cool in summer without central heating or air conditioning. They created tools and techniques that were so effective they remained unchanged for centuries. Their craftsmanship was extraordinary. They built cathedrals that still stand today, created art that still moves us, and developed methods for everything from brewing beer to forging metal that modern experts still study and admire. All of this came from village workshops where knowledge passed from master to apprentice in an unbroken chain of learning. But perhaps most importantly, they understood how to find meaning and joy in ordinary life. They didn't need constant entertainment or endless consumption to feel fulfilled. They found deep satisfaction in work well done, in communities that functioned smoothly, in traditions that connected them to their ancestors and their descendants. Without understanding how they lived, we can't fully understand ourselves. We can't appreciate the incredible achievement of humans learning to live together sustainably. We can't learn from their successes and failures as we face our own challenges. Think about the problems we're struggling with today. Social media has connected us globally, but left many people feeling more isolated than ever. Our economic system creates enormous wealth, but also enormous inequality. We have access to more information than any generation in history, yet many people feel disconnected from meaning and purpose. Medieval villagers solved different versions of these same challenges. They created information networks through storytelling and community gatherings that kept everyone informed about what mattered. They developed economic systems that prioritized community stability over individual accumulation. They built meaning into daily work by connecting it to the survival and thriving of people they cared about. This isn't nostalgia for a simpler time. Medieval life was often harsh and difficult. But it's recognition that these people figured out things we're still struggling with. They knew how to build communities that lasted. They understood how to live sustainably. They found ways to make hard work meaningful. They created systems of mutual support that helped everyone weather both celebration and crisis. Their story is also proof of something we desperately need to remember. Ordinary people, working together, can create something extraordinary. The great achievements of medieval civilization didn't come from kings and nobles. They came from millions of villagers cooperating, innovating, and building better lives for themselves and their children. Tonight, we're not just learning about medieval peasants. We're discovering what humans are capable of when they put community ahead of individual gain, when they think long-term instead of focusing on short-term profit, and when they understand that true wealth isn't what you can accumulate for yourself, but what you can build together that will benefit generations to come. We're exploring a world where people understood that their individual well-being was completely connected to the health of their community and their environment, where they knew that taking care of the land meant it would take care of them, where they realized that preserving traditions and knowledge was just as important as innovating new solutions. This is a masterclass in human resilience, creativity, and cooperation. It's evidence that sustainable, meaningful communities aren't just possible. They're something humans have successfully created and maintained for centuries. And if they could do it with the challenges they faced, surely we can learn from their example to create better communities today. The first thing you need to understand about medieval Europe is that it looked nothing like the world we know today. Forget everything you think you know about neat country borders and organized cities connected by highways. Instead, imagine a vast continent covered in endless forests, broken up by small clearings where groups of people had carved out tiny pockets of civilization. These weren't random settlements scattered wherever people happened to stop. They were carefully planned communities that represented thousands of years of human wisdom about how to survive and thrive together. Picture yourself standing on a hill in the year 1200, looking out over the European countryside. What you'd see stretching to the horizon would be an ocean of green, dense, dark forests that covered nearly half the continent. These weren't the managed woodlands we know today, but wild, dangerous places filled with wolves, bears, and bands of outlaws who preyed on travellers. Between these forests, like islands in a green sea, you'd spot small clusters of buildings surrounded by carefully divided fields. Smoke would be rising from dozens of chimneys, and if you listened carefully, you'd hear the sounds of a working community. Church bells calling people to prayer, the rhythmic hammering of a blacksmith, children's voices and the lowing of cattle. Each of these village clusters was positioned with incredible precision. Medieval people weren't just randomly setting up shop wherever they felt like it. They were following ancient wisdom passed down through generations about where human communities could actually survive long term. They knew that a village needed to be near fresh water, but not so close to a river that spring floods would wash it away. They understood that southern-facing slopes would give them precious extra weeks of growing season, while northern slopes would leave them struggling with shorter summers. They picked spots where the soil was fertile but also well-drained, where they'd have access to forests for wood and hunting, but not so close that wild animals would be a constant threat. What's amazing is how these decisions weren't made by kings or nobles sitting in distant castles. They were made by the people who would actually live there, farmers and craftsmen who understood the land intimately because their lives depended on reading its signs correctly. They could tell you which areas flooded in wet years, where the best clay for pottery could be found, which slopes caught the morning sun, and whether wind patterns would help or hurt their crops. This was practical knowledge built up over centuries, tested by the ultimate standard, survival. The backbone of this entire system was something called the manor. Think of a manor as a complete world in miniature, usually covering several thousand acres that included not just the village itself, but all the surrounding farmland, forests, pastures, streams, and everything else needed to support a community of a few hundred people. At the heart of each manor stood the manor house, home to the lord who owned everything you could see from its windows. Now, when we say owned, this wasn't like buying a house today where you get a deed and that's that. Medieval ownership was more like being the guardian of a massive living system that had been passed down through families for generations. The lord wasn't just a wealthy landowner. He was the judge who settled disputes, the military commander who organized defense against raiders, the economic manager who decided what crops to plant, and the political leader who represented his people to the outside world. It was a huge responsibility that came with both enormous power and serious obligations. The lord couldn't run everything himself, of course. Managing a medieval manor was incredibly complex, requiring a whole hierarchy of officials who each had specialized roles. The bailiff was like the lord's chief operating officer, handling day-to-day management when the lord was away, which was often since many lords owned multiple manors scattered across large distances. The bailiff needed to understand farming, law, accounting, and people management, making him one of the most capable individuals in the entire community. But the most important person for everyday village life was probably the reeve. Unlike other officials who were appointed by the lord, the reeve was elected by the villagers themselves. He was their representative, the bridge between the lord's authority and the community's needs. The reeve organised work groups for major projects like harvest or road repair, made sure everyone contributed their fair share to community tasks, and spoke up for villagers when conflicts arose with higher authorities. It was a job that required incredible diplomatic skills, keeping the lord happy while maintaining the trust and respect of your neighbours. You had to be someone people could rely on, someone who could make fair decisions even when those decisions were difficult. Then there was the village priest who occupied a unique position in this whole system. Unlike everyone else who ultimately answered to the lord of the manor, the priest's authority came from the church hierarchy that stretched all the way to Rome. This gave him a degree of independence that was incredibly valuable. He could sometimes advocate for villagers when they had conflicts with secular authority, but the priest was also deeply woven into village life in ways that might surprise us today. He depended on his parishioners for his living, so he shared their hardships and celebrated their successes. He was often the only person in the village who could read and write, making him the keeper of records, the writer of letters, and the main connection to the wider world beyond the village boundaries. The church building itself was the beating heart of village life. It wasn't just a place where people went on Sundays. It was the community centre, the meeting hall, the emergency shelter, and sometimes the fortress where everyone gathered when danger threatened. The church bells marked the rhythm of daily life, calling people to prayer, announcing births and deaths, and warning of approaching dangers. The churchyard wasn't just a cemetery. It was the main gathering place where people would socialise after services, conduct business, and maintain the relationships that held their community together. Around this spiritual and administrative centre, village society organised itself into layers that might seem complicated to us, but provided medieval people with a clear understanding of their place in the world. At the top of village society, just below the lord, were the free peasants, perhaps one family in 10 who owned their own land and owed service only to the king himself. These were the lucky ones who could move freely, marry whomever they chose, and pass their property to their children without asking anyone's permission. Most villagers, however, lived as villeins, bound to the land and to their lord through obligations that had been passed down through generations. Now, villeins weren't slaves. They had legal rights, owned personal property, and could expect protection from their lord. But they also couldn't leave the manor without permission, couldn't marry without the lord's consent, and owed specific amounts of labour on the lord's land throughout the year. This might sound oppressive to us, but it actually provided a kind of security that free peasants sometimes lacked. When times got tough, during famines, wars, or natural disasters, the lord was obligated to support his villeins, providing seed grain, emergency food, and protection that could mean the difference between life and death. At the bottom of the social ladder were the serfs, people whose families had fallen into bondage through debt, capture in war, or simply being born into that status. Serfs had fewer rights and owed more service to their lord, but even they weren't powerless. Medieval law protected them from arbitrary treatment and guaranteed them access to land for growing their own food. The differences between villeins and serfs mattered in legal terms, but in daily life, both groups spent their time working the land, raising families, and participating in the community activities that made villages more than just collections of struggling individuals. Within these broad categories, village society recognized all sorts of subtle distinctions that reflected wealth, skill, family history, and personal reputation. Take the miller, for example. Everyone depended on his services to turn grain into flour, so he occupied a special position in the community. But millers were also widely distrusted because their opportunity to skim a little extra for themselves was so obvious. People would joke that you could always tell a miller by his golden thumb, stained from testing the quality of grain that somehow never made it into their flour sacks. Skilled craftsmen like blacksmiths, carpenters, and potters enjoyed respect for their essential abilities, but they also faced suspicion from their more purely agricultural neighbours, who sometimes thought they had easier lives. After all, the blacksmith got to work indoors by a nice warm fire all winter, while the farmers were out in the cold, harsh weather. But these craftsmen also carried enormous responsibility. When the plough broke during planting season, or when someone needed specialised tools for harvest, the community's survival could depend on their skills. Family relationships in medieval villages were both simpler and more complex than what we're used to today. Simpler because most people lived their entire lives within a few miles of where they were born, creating extended family networks where cousins, aunts, uncles, and grandparents all lived within walking distance. More complex because these family networks carried obligations and expectations that went far beyond the nuclear family. When someone fell ill, lost a harvest, or needed help with a major project, they could count on relatives to provide assistance, but they were also expected to provide the same help when others needed it. Marriage was rarely the romantic choice we expect today. Families arranged most marriages, considering factors like land ownership, family reputation, and economic compatibility as much as personal attraction. But this doesn't mean medieval marriages were loveless. Couples often developed deep affection over years of shared work and responsibility, and village communities generally expected husbands and wives to treat each other with respect and consideration. Marriages that involved serious abuse or neglect faced community pressure and, in extreme cases, intervention by church authorities. Children started contributing to family welfare from an early age. By 5 or 6, they were helping with simple tasks like feeding chickens or gathering eggs. By 10 or 12, they were taking on substantial responsibilities like herding animals or learning specialised skills from parents or other adults. This wasn't considered child labour in the modern sense. It was seen as essential preparation for adult life in a world where everyone needed to contribute their skills and efforts to the common good. Now let's talk about what these villages actually looked like. The physical layout reflected both practical necessities and social relationships in ways that would strike us as both familiar and strange. Familiar because the basic elements, houses, streets, common areas and working spaces, serve similar functions in any human community. Strange because the priorities that determined how these elements were arranged were very different from modern urban planning. At the heart of most villages was the village green, an open space that served multiple functions throughout the year. During good weather, it was where children played, adults gathered to socialise, and the whole community assembled for important announcements or celebrations. During harvest time, the green became a giant workspace where grain was threshed, sorted, and prepared for storage. During emergencies, it could serve as a meeting place for defence or as temporary shelter for people whose homes had been damaged by fire or storms. The houses that surrounded the village green or lined the village streets were far simpler than modern homes. but they were carefully designed for the lives their inhabitants actually lived. A typical peasant house was basically one large room that served as kitchen, dining area, workshop and bedroom for the entire family. This wasn't because people were too poor or ignorant to build separate rooms. It was a practical solution that made the most sense for medieval life. Heating was expensive and difficult, so one room was much easier to keep warm. Cooking was done over an open fire that also provided light and heat. And in a world where survival depended on everyone working together, the open layout meant that family members could easily coordinate their activities. Animals often shared the building with people, living in one end while the family occupied the other. This might sound unsanitary to us, but it actually made perfect sense. The animals provided extra warmth during cold months, and having them right there made it easy to care for valuable livestock. The house walls were usually made of timber frames filled with wattle and daub, a mixture of sticks, mud and straw that provided surprisingly good insulation when properly maintained. The roof was typically thatched with straw or reeds. Thatch required regular maintenance and posed fire risks, but it also provided excellent insulation, keeping houses warm in winter and cool in summer. Windows were small and rarely had glass. That was far too expensive for ordinary people. Instead, they could be shuttered against bad weather and covered with oiled cloth or thin animal membranes that let in light while keeping out wind and rain. Inside these homes, families made incredibly efficient use of their limited space. Sleeping areas were often raised platforms or alcoves that could be separated from the main room by hanging cloths. Storage was a constant challenge. Grain, tools, clothing, and personal possessions all had to be kept safe from moisture, pests, and theft in a space that had to serve many other purposes. Wooden chests and clay pots held precious belongings, while larger items like ploughs or looms might be shared with neighbours or stored in common buildings. Around the village centre, the landscape was divided into carefully planned sections that reflected centuries of experience in making the best use of available land. The farmland was typically arranged in long strips, so individual families could have access to different types of soil. Some strips would be in heavy clay that held moisture well, others in lighter soil that drained quickly and warmed up early in spring. This system meant that good years and bad years were shared more or less equally among village families, preventing the extreme inequality that might result if some people happened to own only the best land while others got stuck with poor fields. Beyond the crop fields were the meadows where hay was grown to feed animals through the winter. Meadowland was incredibly precious because hay was the only reliable way to keep cattle, horses and sheep alive when natural pastures were covered with snow. The allocation of meadow strips was carefully regulated, with families receiving shares based on their land holdings and their contributions to community work. Further from the village centre were the common pastures where everyone's animals grazed together under the watchful eyes of community herders. This system made efficient use of land that wasn't good enough for crops, while giving every village family access to the benefits of keeping animals, regardless of how much land they individually owned. Managing these common pastures required sophisticated cooperation. Decisions about when animals could be turned onto different areas, how many animals each family could graze, and how to prevent overuse that would damage the land for future years. At the edges of the cultivated land lay the forest that provided fuel, building materials and food supplements essential to village survival. But access to forest resources was carefully controlled. Families might have rights to collect dead wood for fuel, gather nuts and berries for food, or graze pigs on fallen acorns, but cutting live trees usually required permission from the Lord. This wasn't arbitrary control. It reflected hard-learned lessons about the importance of preserving forest resources for future generations while meeting the immediate needs of the current community. Water sources were perhaps the most critical element in village planning. Every village had to have reliable access to clean water for drinking, cooking, brewing, washing, and watering animals. The location of springs, streams, or wells often determined where the village centre would be built, and protecting water quality was a constant community concern. Wells were carefully maintained and protected from contamination. Streams were regulated to prevent upstream users from polluting water needed downstream. During dry periods, water use was carefully rationed to ensure that human needs were met first, followed by essential animals. The miller's establishment deserves special mention because it was one of the most important and complex installations in village life. Mills required substantial investment and technical expertise to build and maintain, which is why they were typically owned by the lord rather than individual villagers. The mill pond, mill race, and mill building were major features that affected drainage, flood patterns, and land use throughout the area. The miller's house was often one of the largest buildings in the village, reflecting both the importance of his role and the income his essential services generated. Defence was another consideration that shaped village layout in ways that weren't always obvious, but were never far from planners' minds. Villages were typically built in locations that offered some natural protection, on hilltops that could be defended, behind rivers that would slow attackers, or in forest clearings that would prevent surprise attacks. Houses were often arranged so they could provide mutual support during emergencies, with connected yards and walls that could channel attackers into areas where defenders would have advantages. Some villages had more formal defensive structures, wooden palisades, watchtowers, or even small stone fortifications, but most depended on the natural defensibility of their locations combined with the fighting ability of their inhabitants. Every adult man was expected to be capable of contributing to village defense, and most households kept weapons and basic armor appropriate to their social status and economic means. The church, with its stone construction and elevated position, often served as the strongest defensive position in the village, a place where the entire community could take shelter if other defences failed. This physical landscape of fields, forests, streams and buildings formed the stage where the drama of medieval village life played out day after day, season after season, year after year. But it was more than just a stage. It was an active participant in shaping how people lived, what they could accomplish, what challenges they faced, and what opportunities were available to them. Every field had its purpose, every building had its place, and every family understood their role in maintaining this carefully balanced system. What's remarkable is that this wasn't primitive or backward. It was actually incredibly sophisticated. These villages represented the solution to complex problems of social organization, economic production, and resource management that had been refined over hundreds of years. The people who created and maintained these communities weren't struggling to survive in a harsh world. They were successful communities who had figured out how to live sustainably and prosperously within the constraints of their time and place. In this carefully organized world, thousands of villages provided homes for millions of people, who created a way of life so successful that it lasted for nearly 1,000 years. They built something that modern society, with all our technology and resources, still struggles to achieve: truly sustainable communities where people could live, work, and thrive together while maintaining harmony with the natural environment that supported them all. Now that we understand the carefully planned world these medieval villagers inhabited, let's step inside their homes and discover how they actually lived from sunrise to sunset. The rhythm of daily life in a medieval village was unlike anything we know today. No alarm clocks, no electric lights, no grocery stores. Everything people needed to survive they had to create, grow, or make with their own hands. Imagine walking up to a typical peasant home on a crisp morning in medieval England. What you'd see might surprise you. These weren't the crude huts that many people picture, but carefully designed buildings that represented centuries of practical wisdom about living in harmony with the local climate and available materials. Every aspect of these homes, from their placement to their construction, reflected generations of trial and error by families who understood that a well-built house could mean the difference between comfort and misery, even life and death. The walls of most peasant homes were built using a technique that sounds almost magical: wattle and daub. Picture this. Builders would first create a framework of heavy timber posts, like the skeleton of the house. Then they'd weave thin branches, reeds, and twigs between these posts, creating what looked like giant baskets. This woven framework was called wattle. Over this, they'd apply daub, a mixture that sounds like a recipe from an ancient cookbook: clay, chopped straw, animal dung, and water, all mixed together by hand until it reached just the right consistency. This wasn't primitive technology, it was incredibly effective. The timber frame provided strength and flexibility, able to bend slightly with strong winds rather than breaking. The wattle created an excellent foundation for the walls, while the daub provided insulation that kept homes warm in winter and cool in summer. When properly maintained, these walls could last for decades, protecting families through countless seasons of harsh weather. The roof was typically made of thatch, layers of straw, reed, or other plant materials laid in overlapping patterns that shed water, like the feathers on a duck's back. A skilled thatcher was a valuable member of any community, because their work determined whether a family stayed dry through the long, wet months of winter. The thick layers of thatch didn't just keep out rain, they provided excellent insulation, keeping the interior temperature stable year-round. In summer, a thatched roof stayed cool, while in winter it trapped precious heat inside. Most homes had small windows, if any at all. Glass was incredibly expensive, a luxury that only the wealthy could afford. Instead, window openings could be covered with wooden shutters during bad weather, or with thin sheets made from animal intestines or oiled cloth that let in some light while keeping out the wind and rain. These windows were deliberately kept small to minimize heat loss during cold months, though this meant that even during daytime the interior of most homes remained relatively dim. Step inside one of these homes and you'd immediately notice how different the living space was from anything we're used to today. Most peasant families lived in what was essentially one large room that served every purpose imaginable. Kitchen, dining room, workshop, bedroom, and sometimes even shelter for their most valuable animals. This wasn't because people were too poor to build separate rooms. It was actually a smart solution to the challenges of medieval life. Heating was expensive and difficult, so one room was much easier to keep warm than several separate spaces. Cooking was done over a fire that also provided heat and light, so it made sense to have everyone close to this central hearth. And in a world where survival depended on everyone in the family working together, the open layout meant that parents could supervise children, share tools and workspace, and coordinate all their daily activities. The heart of every home was the fire, usually located in the centre of the main room. This wasn't just a fireplace like we know today, it was an open fire pit where a small flame burned continuously from season to season. Letting this fire go out completely was a serious problem, because rekindling it required flint, steel, and dry tinder, a process that could take considerable time and effort. Families would bank their fires at night, covering the coals with ash to keep them smouldering until morning, when they could be coaxed back to full flame. This central fire served multiple purposes that might seem impossible to manage in one location. It provided warmth during cold months, light during dark hours, and heat for cooking all meals. The area around the hearth became the social centre of family life, where members gathered in the evening to share food, maintain their tools, tell stories, and plan the next day's work. Managing smoke in these homes required ingenious solutions. Most didn't have proper chimneys. Those were expensive and required specialised construction skills. Instead, smoke from the fire rose naturally to the upper part of the room and escaped through a hole in the roof or through gaps in the thatch. While this might sound uncomfortable, it actually provided several benefits. The constant exposure to smoke helped preserve the wooden roof timbers by deterring insects and preventing rot, while the warm air helped keep the entire house dry and prevented ice formation during winter. The furniture inside these homes was minimal but functional. A sturdy wooden table served for food preparation, eating and work activities during the day, then was often moved aside or folded away when the space was needed for other purposes. Simple stools or benches provided seating and could be easily rearranged depending on the activity. Everything had to serve multiple functions because space was limited and wood was too valuable to waste on single-purpose items. Sleeping arrangements reflected both practical needs and family relationships. Rather than individual beds, most families used simple sleeping platforms or raised areas covered with straw mattresses and whatever blankets or coverings they could make or acquire. These sleeping areas were typically positioned in the warmest part of the house, usually near the hearth, and family members slept close together for warmth and security. Parents usually slept closest to the fire, both to stay warm and to maintain easy access for tending the flames during cold nights. Privacy, as we understand it today, simply didn't exist in medieval peasant homes. Everything happened within sight and hearing of other family members, cooking, eating, working, personal care, even intimate moments between spouses. This arrangement fostered incredibly close family bonds and ensured that children learned adult skills through constant observation. But it also required careful social protocols about when and how various activities could be conducted without causing discomfort or conflict. Storage was one of the biggest challenges families faced. Every possession had to be carefully preserved against moisture, pests, and theft. Yet everything had to fit within the single room that served all other purposes. Wooden chests and boxes held clothing, tools, and valuable items, often positioned near sleeping areas where they could also serve as seating or work surfaces. Clay pots and jars contained food supplies, cooking ingredients, and various household materials, arranged on shelves or platforms that kept them off the floor and away from dampness. Preserving food required specialized storage techniques that medieval families had perfected through generations of experience. Root cellars, dug beneath the main house or nearby, provided cool, stable temperatures for storing vegetables, dairy products, and other perishables throughout the year. These underground chambers were carefully lined with stone or wood to prevent collapse, and designed to manage moisture levels that could either preserve or spoil stored food. Grain storage was particularly critical since the family's supply of wheat, barley, oats, and other cereals represented their primary defense against hunger during the long months between harvest and the next growing season. Large wooden containers, sometimes lined with clay to deter mice and insects, held these precious supplies. These storage containers were positioned in the driest, most secure part of the house and checked regularly for signs of spoilage or pest damage that could destroy months of hard work. The daily rhythm of medieval village life began well before sunrise, when the head of the household would rise in the darkness to tend the fire that had been carefully banked overnight. This early morning ritual was crucial. If the fire had died completely during the night, the family faced the difficult task of creating new flames from scratch. Once the fire was restored and providing warmth and light, other family members would gradually wake to begin their carefully orchestrated daily routine. Morning prayers mark the official start of each day for medieval peasants, who lived within a deeply religious framework that wove spiritual observance into every aspect of daily life. These prayers were typically simple and brief, thanking God for protection through the night and asking for blessings on the day's work. But they represented an essential connection between individual families and the broader Christian community that defined medieval society. The morning meal required careful coordination among family members, since the single cooking space and limited utensils meant that food preparation had to be done in sequence. The simplest morning food usually consisted of porridge made from whatever grains were available, cooked in the same iron pot that would be used for other meals throughout the day. This porridge provided essential nutrition and warmth to fuel the day's work, while its preparation allowed the cook to assess the fire's condition and check on food supplies. Work assignments within peasant families followed patterns that had been tested over generations. Everyone understood their specific responsibilities based on age, gender, and physical ability. Adult men typically handled the heaviest agricultural work, ploughing, harvesting, caring for large animals, and maintaining tools that required significant strength. Women managed household production, food preparation, textile work, and childcare, while also participating in seasonal farm work that required every available hand. Children began contributing to family survival from a remarkably early age. By 5 or 6, they were feeding chickens, gathering eggs, and collecting kindling for the fire. By 10 or 12, they were taking on substantial responsibilities like herding animals, helping with harvest work, and learning specialized skills that would serve them throughout their lives. This wasn't considered child labor in the modern sense. It was essential preparation for adult life in a world where everyone needed to contribute their skills and efforts to the family's survival. The morning hours were devoted to the most demanding physical work, taking advantage of cooler temperatures and the energy that came from a night's rest. Men departed for the fields with their tools, while women organized household activities that might include spinning, weaving, brewing, baking, or any of dozens of other tasks essential to family welfare. The specific work varied according to season and weather, but the underlying pattern of intensive morning labor remained constant throughout medieval village life. Around midday, families paused for their main meal, and a brief rest during the hottest part of the day. This midday dinner was typically more substantial than the morning porridge, often including bread when grain was available, along with cheese, vegetables, and occasionally meat or fish, depending on the season and the family's circumstances. The preparation and sharing of this meal provided an opportunity for family members to exchange information about the morning's work and coordinate afternoon activities. Afternoon work continued the day's labor, but often with different priorities. Women might focus on tasks that could be done near the home, allowing them to monitor cooking for the evening meal while continuing productive work. Children who had been helping with morning field work might return to learn domestic skills or assist with age-appropriate tasks around the house. Men might continue field work if conditions were favorable, or turn to equipment maintenance and other projects that required afternoon attention. As evening approached, the pace of work gradually shifted toward completing daily tasks and preparing for the night ahead. Animals needed to be fed, watered, and secured against predators and weather. Tools required cleaning and proper storage to prevent rust and damage. The evening fire needed to be built up to provide warmth, light, and cooking heat for the family's evening meal and the long hours of darkness that lay ahead. The evening meal represented the most social time of the peasant day, when the entire family gathered around the hearth to share food and the day's experiences. This meal often featured whatever variety of ingredients the family could afford, and always centered around bread when grain supplies permitted. The preparation and consumption of evening food provided opportunities for conversation, instruction of children, planning for the next day, and maintaining the family relationships that were essential to household survival. After the evening meal, the hours before sleep were devoted to indoor activities that could be performed by firelight. Women continued spinning thread, weaving cloth, or mending clothing and household items that required constant maintenance. Men worked on tool repair, wood carving, or other crafts that contributed to family welfare. Children received instruction in adult skills, religious teachings, and the oral traditions that preserved family and community history. The clothing worn by medieval peasants reflects the same practical considerations that governed every aspect of their lives. Functionality, durability, and economy balanced against social expectations and seasonal needs. Understanding how these families dressed reveals not only their relationship with textiles and fashion, but also their remarkable skill in creating everything they wore from raw materials they produced themselves. The foundation of peasant clothing was linen made from flax plants grown in local fields. The process of turning flax into wearable cloth was long and labour-intensive, beginning with the cultivation of the plants themselves. Flax required careful timing and specific growing conditions to produce fibres suitable for textile production. After harvest, the flax had to be processed through multiple steps: retting to separate the fibres, breaking to remove woody parts, scutching to clean the fibres, and combing to prepare them for spinning. Wool provided the second essential material for peasant clothing, obtained from sheep raised by the family or acquired through trade with neighbours. The annual shearing of sheep provided raw wool that required careful cleaning, sorting, and preparation before it could be spun into thread. Different qualities of wool were allocated to different uses: the finest fleeces for special occasions, coarser materials for everyday work clothes. Creating cloth from these raw materials represented one of the most time-consuming activities in medieval peasant households. Spinning wool or linen fibres into thread required specialised tools including spindles and later spinning wheels, along with techniques that took years to master. Women and girls spent countless hours spinning, often while walking, talking, or attending to other tasks that allowed them to keep their hands busy with this essential work. Weaving the spun thread into cloth required additional equipment and skills. Simple looms, constructed from wood and operated entirely by hand, allowed experienced weavers to create the various types of fabric needed for family clothing and household textiles. The weaving process required careful planning about thread colours, patterns, and the intended use of the finished cloth, since mistakes could waste weeks or months of spinning work. Medieval peasants adapted their clothing to the changing seasons through layering and fabric choices rather than maintaining separate wardrobes. Winter clothing emphasized warmth and protection from harsh weather, featuring heavy woolen garments that could be layered for maximum insulation. Summer clothing prioritized comfort and freedom of movement during intensive agricultural work, often featuring lighter linen garments that allowed air circulation while protecting skin from sun and scratches. The basic elements of peasant clothing remained fairly consistent across medieval Europe. Men typically wore a simple tunic that extended to the knees or mid-thigh, made from linen or wool depending on the season and available materials. Over this, they might wear a sleeveless vest or jacket for additional warmth and protection. Simple leg coverings, often wrapped and tied rather than sewn, protected the legs while allowing the flexibility required for various work activities. Women's clothing followed similar principles of functionality and modesty. Long tunics or dresses provided appropriate coverage while allowing the movement necessary for household and agricultural work. Aprons or outer garments protected their clothing during messy work while providing additional pockets for tools and small items. Head coverings were nearly universal among married women, serving both practical and social functions by protecting hair and indicating marital status. Footwear represented a particular challenge for medieval peasants. The constant wear of agricultural work quickly destroyed even well-made shoes, and leather remained expensive relative to other materials. Many peasants spent significant portions of the year barefoot or wearing temporary foot coverings made from cloth, straw, or other readily available materials. When families could afford proper shoes, these were carefully preserved for special occasions or particularly harsh weather. The social significance of clothing extended far beyond practical considerations. Even within the relatively narrow economic range of village society, subtle differences in fabric quality, garment construction, and decorative details conveyed information about the wearer's position in the community. While peasants couldn't afford the elaborate clothing of nobility, they still used clothing choices to express status, prosperity, and personal character within their social environment. Personal hygiene and grooming practices among medieval peasants balanced cleanliness with the practical limitations of their circumstances. Contrary to popular myths about medieval cleanliness, most peasants maintained reasonable standards of personal hygiene within the constraints of limited resources and seasonal variations in water availability. Bathing typically occurred on a weekly basis, depending on water availability and weather conditions. Complete body washing usually took place in wooden tubs filled with water heated over the household fire, a process that required considerable time and fuel. More frequent washing focused on hands, face, and other exposed areas that accumulated dirt during daily work. Rivers, streams, and village wells provided water sources, though seasonal changes meant that bathing practices had to adapt to changing conditions throughout the year. Hair care reflected both practical needs and social expectations. Long hair could harbour pests and interfere with work, so most peasants kept their hair at practical lengths that balanced cleanliness with social norms. Regular combing helped remove tangles and debris, while various herbal preparations cleaned hair and discouraged pest infestations. Men typically wore their hair shorter than women, reflecting both work requirements and social customs. Dental care, while limited by available knowledge, wasn't entirely neglected. Simple tooth cleaning using cloth, salt, or herbal preparations helped maintain basic oral hygiene. The medieval diet, while often nutritionally limited, included fewer refined sugars than modern food, which helped reduce tooth decay. Though the coarse texture of many foods contributed to tooth wear over time, special occasion clothing represented some of the most valued possessions in peasant households. These garments were carefully preserved for religious festivals, weddings, funerals, and other significant community events. Made from the finest materials the family could afford, they often featured decorative elements like embroidery or coloured threads that distinguished them from everyday work clothes. Creating these special garments required the best skills of household textile workers and often represented months of careful planning and execution. Food was the foundation of medieval peasant life, and bread was the foundation of peasant food. Understanding how these families fed themselves reveals not only their nutritional practices, but also their deep connection to the agricultural cycle, their remarkable skills in food preservation, and their ability to create satisfying meals from simple ingredients. Bread provided the majority of calories consumed by medieval peasant families throughout the year. The type of bread varied considerably depending on what grains were available and affordable. Wheat produced the finest bread with the best texture and flavour, but it required specific growing conditions and favourable weather that made it expensive and sometimes unreliable. Barley, rye and oats served as more dependable alternatives that could grow in poorer soils and harsher climates, producing darker, denser breads with different nutritional profiles. The process of making bread required community cooperation, since individual families couldn't afford the equipment needed for proper bread production. After grain was harvested and properly stored, it had to be ground into flour at mills that were typically owned by the lord of the manor and operated as shared village resources. These mills, powered by water or wind, represented major investments that individual families couldn't make, making them essential elements of village infrastructure. Most peasant homes lacked ovens suitable for baking bread, since constructing and maintaining such ovens required materials, skills, and fuel beyond the reach of individual households. Instead, many villages maintained community baking ovens that families could use on scheduled days, bringing their prepared dough to facilities that could produce proper bread with maximum fuel efficiency. The types of bread consumed by peasants varied according to season, grain availability, and family economics. The finest white bread made from carefully sifted wheat flour was reserved for special occasions and wealthier families. Most peasant families ate darker breads made from rye, barley, or mixed grains that provided adequate nutrition while making efficient use of available resources. Seasonal changes created a complex annual cycle of food availability that required careful planning and resource management. Spring represented the most challenging time, as stored food supplies reached their lowest levels while new crops hadn't yet matured. During these hunger months, families often supplemented their limited grain supplies with wild plants, early garden vegetables, and whatever other foods they could gather or produce. Summer brought relative abundance as gardens produced fresh vegetables, dairy animals provided milk and cheese, and various wild foods became available. This seasonal plenty required intensive work to preserve surplus food for later use, since medieval families understood that summer's abundance had to sustain them through autumn, winter, and the following spring. Food preservation techniques including salting, smoking, drying, and fermenting allowed families to extend the availability of seasonal foods throughout the year. Autumn was the critical harvest season, when the success or failure of grain crops determined whether families would have adequate food for the coming year. Every family member participated in harvest activities that required completion within narrow time windows determined by weather and crop maturity. The timing and efficiency of harvest work could literally mean the difference between prosperity and starvation. Winter food consumption relied heavily on preserved and stored foods accumulated during earlier seasons. Fresh food was limited to root vegetables stored in cellars, occasional fresh meat from animals slaughtered during cold months, and whatever other foods could be produced during the cold season. Managing winter food supplies required careful rationing to ensure that stored foods lasted until spring brought new sources of nutrition. Cooking methods reflected both the limited equipment available and the need to maximize nutrition from whatever ingredients were accessible. The central hearth fire served all cooking needs, requiring families to coordinate their food preparation around the single heat source that also provided warmth and light. Large iron pots suspended over the fire served for most cooking tasks, from boiling porridge and stews to heating water for various household needs. The typical peasant diet consisted primarily of porridge, bread, and simple stews that combined whatever vegetables, grains, and occasionally meat were available according to season and family circumstances. These one-pot meals made efficient use of fuel, while combining multiple ingredients to create nutritious food that could feed large families from relatively small amounts of expensive ingredients like meat or cheese. Herbs and seasonings, when available, enhanced the flavor of simple foods, while sometimes providing additional nutritional or medicinal benefits. Medieval peasants had extensive knowledge of local plants that could improve both the taste and healthfulness of their meals, though the availability of these additions varied considerably with season and location. Religious festivals and feast days created important variations in normal food patterns. These special occasions provided opportunities for enhanced meals that included better foods, larger portions, and social eating that strengthened community bonds while marking important spiritual observances. Feast days represented breaks from the routine limitations of peasant diet, though they also required careful planning to ensure that special foods were available when needed. The nutritional implications of the medieval peasant diet were complex. The high proportion of whole grains provided adequate calories and essential nutrients, while the absence of refined sugars and processed foods eliminated many sources of modern nutritional problems. However, the limited variety of available foods, particularly during difficult seasons, could create vitamin deficiencies and other nutritional challenges that affected health and productivity. From the construction of their carefully designed homes to the clothes they wove and the bread they baked, medieval peasants created a complete way of life that sustained families and communities through centuries of changing conditions. Every aspect of their daily existence reflected generations of accumulated wisdom about living successfully within the constraints and opportunities of their time and place. Their solutions to fundamental human needs, shelter, warmth, nutrition, and community, created patterns of sustainable living that modern society is only beginning to understand and appreciate. The rhythm of their days, governed by natural light and seasonal changes rather than artificial schedules, created a deep harmony between human activity and environmental cycles. Their integration of work, family life, and spiritual practice within the single space of their homes fostered relationships and skills that sustained them through both prosperity and hardship. Most remarkably, they accomplished all of this while maintaining the social bonds and cultural traditions that made medieval village life not just survivable, but meaningful and fulfilling for the millions of people who lived it. Understanding how medieval peasants lived their daily lives reveals only part of their remarkable story. To truly grasp their world, we must see how everything they did, from the moment they woke to the clothes they wore to the food they ate, was shaped by a force more powerful than any king or lord, the turning of the seasons. Their entire existence revolved around the agricultural cycle, a rhythm so fundamental that it determined not just when they worked and what they ate, but when they celebrated, when they married, and even when they could afford to rest. This wasn't simply about farming. The seasonal cycle was the heartbeat of medieval civilization, the invisible force that synchronized the lives of millions across Europe. Every peasant family lived in constant awareness of where they stood in this eternal cycle, whether it was time to plant or harvest, to celebrate or prepare for hardship, to welcome new life or brace for the lean months ahead. Their survival depended on reading nature's signals correctly and responding at exactly the right moments. When the first green shoots began pushing through the thawing ground, medieval villages stirred to life with an energy that had been dormant through the long winter months. Spring wasn't just the return of warmth. It was the season that would determine whether families would eat well or go hungry in the year ahead. Everything that happened in these crucial weeks would echo through the rest of the agricultural cycle. The preparation began before the snow had fully melted. Men would inspect their ploughs, checking every wooden beam and iron share for damage from the previous year's work. These weren't simple tools. They were the foundation of family survival, and a broken plough at the wrong moment could spell disaster. The heavy wooden implements had been designed and refined over generations, perfectly suited to turning the dense European soil that would feed entire communities. Ploughing itself was back-breaking work that required perfect timing. Too early, and the wet soil would turn into unusable clumps. Too late, and the brief window for spring planting would close. Peasant families had learned to read subtle signs that modern people have forgotten. The feel of soil between their fingers, the behaviour of certain birds, the way morning frost formed on different surfaces. These weren't superstitions, but practical wisdom accumulated over centuries. The actual ploughing created one of the most characteristic sights of medieval spring, long furrows stretching across fields, with oxen or horses straining against wooden yokes, while men guided heavy ploughs through earth that released the rich, dark smell of fertile soil. This work required community cooperation, as few families owned enough animals to pull a plough alone. Neighbours would pull their oxen, taking turns to prepare each family's strips in the great open fields that surrounded every village. Seed selection was a science that peasant families had perfected through generations of careful observation. They saved their best grain from each harvest, storing it in specially prepared containers and testing its viability as spring approached. Different varieties were chosen for different conditions, some grains that grew well in wet years, others that could survive drought. This wasn't random. It was sophisticated agricultural planning based on intimate knowledge of local conditions. The actual planting was often accompanied by rituals that modern people might dismiss as superstition, but served important psychological and social functions. Blessing the fields, choosing auspicious days for sowing, and performing ceremonies to ensure good harvests helped bind communities together, while providing emotional support during the anxious time when families were literally betting their survival on seeds buried in the soil. Spring was also the season when farm animals gave birth, filling barns and pastures with new life that represented both hope and additional responsibility. Pregnant cows, pigs, sheep, and goats had been carefully tended through the winter, and their offspring would provide milk, meat, and wool for the coming year. But young animals were also vulnerable, requiring constant attention from family members who understood that losing livestock could push a household towards starvation. Women took primary responsibility for the kitchen gardens that would supplement the family's grain-based diet with vegetables, herbs, and medicinal plants. These small plots near the house were intensively cultivated spaces where families grew onions, leeks, cabbage, peas, and dozens of other plants that would provide both nutrition and flavour throughout the year. The garden also served as the family pharmacy, producing herbs that could treat everything from headaches to serious illnesses. The religious calendar intertwined seamlessly with agricultural activities, providing both spiritual meaning and practical scheduling for community work. Easter, celebrating resurrection and new life, naturally fell during spring planting season. May Day festivals honoured fertility and growth. These weren't just religious observances, but community celebrations that reinforced social bonds and provided occasions for young people to meet potential marriage partners. As spring gave way to summer, the frantic pace of planting was replaced by the steady rhythm of maintenance and growth. This was the season when crops stretched toward the sun, when pastures turned green with grass, and when families worked to ensure that their spring efforts would yield a successful harvest. Summer brought its own challenges and opportunities, its own patterns of work and celebration. The growing crops required constant attention. Weeds competed with grain for nutrients and space, requiring regular hoeing and hand-pulling by every family member old enough to work. This wasn't casual gardening. Weeds could reduce harvests enough to mean the difference between adequate food and hunger. Children as young as 5 or 6 learned to identify different plants and understand which ones belonged in the fields and which ones threatened the family's survival. Pest management was a constant battle fought with methods that combined practical effectiveness with whatever resources were available. Birds that ate grain were scared away with noisemakers and scarecrows. Insects were picked off plants by hand or controlled with preparations made from local plants. Families developed detailed knowledge about which pests appeared at what times and how to minimize their damage without the chemical pesticides that modern agriculture depends on. Haymaking represented one of summer's most critical activities. The grass that would feed animals through the winter had to be cut at exactly the right moment, when it was mature enough to be nutritious, but before it became too coarse to digest easily. This work required perfect coordination with weather patterns, as hay needed several days of sunshine to dry properly. A family could lose their entire hay crop to an unexpected rainstorm, leaving their animals to starve the following winter. The actual process of making hay was a community effort that brought entire villages together. Men would cut the grass with long-handled scythes. moving across meadows in coordinated lines. Women and children would spread the cut grass to dry, then gather it into haycocks that could be quickly covered if the rain threatened. When the hay was properly dried, everyone would work together to transport it to storage barns, creating massive stacks that represented security through the coming winter. Summer was also the season for construction and repair projects that were impossible during winter weather. Roofs damaged by winter storms needed new thatch. Walls required fresh daub to seal cracks that could let in cold air. Tools worn by months of use needed repair or replacement. This work required specialized skills that were shared throughout the community. The thatcher who understood how to lay straw so it would shed water, the carpenter who could repair wooden implements, the blacksmith who could forge new iron tools. Market days brought summer communities together in ways that combined economic necessity with social interaction. Surplus produce from gardens and farms could be traded for goods that families couldn't produce themselves. These weekly gatherings in village centres or nearby towns were information exchanges where news travelled, marriages were arranged, and communities stayed connected to the wider world beyond their immediate neighbourhoods. The summer festival calendar reflected both religious tradition and practical agricultural needs. Midsummer celebrations honoured the longest day of the year and the peak of growing season. Saints' days provided occasions for community feasts and religious observances. These festivals weren't just entertainment. They were essential social institutions that maintained community bonds, provided outlets for accumulated tensions, and created shared memories that held villages together through difficult times. Trade activities expanded during summer months when travel was easier, and surpluses were available for exchange. Travelling merchants brought goods from distant places, salt for preserving food, iron for tools, luxury items that added variety to otherwise simple rural lives. Local craftsmen used summer months to produce goods that could be traded at regional fairs, creating connections between isolated villages and the broader medieval economy. Autumn was the season when all of spring's hopes and summer's work came to fruition, or ended in disaster. The harvest would determine whether families had enough food to survive the coming winter and spring, whether they could pay their obligations to lords and church, and whether they could save enough seed for the next year's planting. No season carried more weight or required more precise timing than these crucial months when grain ripened in the fields. Harvest timing was critical beyond modern understanding. Grain had to be cut when it was fully mature, but before weather could damage it or birds could eat too much of it. Families watched their fields with the intensity of generals observing battlefields, looking for the exact moment when wheat, barley, rye, and oats reached perfect ripeness. Too early and the grain would be immature and yield poorly. Too late, and storms could flatten crops or excessive moisture could cause sprouting that ruined stored grain. The actual harvest was the most intensive work period of the medieval year, requiring every available person from small children to elderly grandparents. Men would cut grain with sickles or scythes, moving through fields in coordinated teams. Women and children would gather the cut grain into bundles called sheaves, then arrange these into larger stacks called stooks that allowed grain to continue drying in the fields. The pace was relentless. Entire communities worked from dawn to dusk, racing against weather and time. Community cooperation reached its peak during harvest season. Families would work together to bring in everyone's grain, understanding that their own survival depended on the success of their neighbours. Harvest crews would move from farm to farm, ensuring that no family lost their crop because they lacked sufficient labour. This mutual aid wasn't charity. It was practical insurance that created networks of reciprocal obligation that strengthened entire communities. Threshing grain to separate edible seeds from inedible stalks was labour-intensive work that continued long after the cutting was finished. Families would beat harvested grain with flails, wooden tools specifically designed for this purpose, or have horses or oxen trample it to break seeds loose from stalks. The grain then had to be winnowed, using baskets and the natural wind to separate heavier seeds from lighter chaff. This work continued through autumn and often into winter months. Food preservation became urgent business as soon as harvest was complete. Grain had to be properly dried and stored in containers that would protect it from moisture and rodents. Vegetables from kitchen gardens needed to be pickled, dried, or stored in root cellars. Fruits were turned into preserves or dried for winter eating. Every family became a small food processing operation, working to transform seasonal abundance into supplies that would last through months when fresh food was unavailable. Animal slaughter represented one of autumn's most important but difficult tasks. Livestock that couldn't be fed through winter had to be killed and preserved before cold weather set in. This wasn't casual butchery. It required careful planning about which animals to keep for breeding and which to slaughter, precise timing to ensure meat could be properly preserved, and skilled techniques for smoking, salting, and drying meat that would remain edible for months. The preservation of meat involved methods that had been refined over generations. Salt, when families could afford it, was rubbed into meat surfaces to draw out moisture and prevent spoilage. Smoking over carefully maintained fires imparted flavor while creating chemical compounds that helped preserve meat. Sausages were made by grinding meat with spices and stuffing it into cleaned animal intestines, creating portable protein that could be stored for extended periods. Autumn also brought the year's reckoning with authority. Tax and rent collectors appeared in villages to claim their shares of the harvest. Peasant families had to surrender portions of their grain, animals, or labour to lords, church officials, and royal representatives. These obligations weren't optional. Failure to pay could result in losing land, facing legal punishment, or being unable to secure protection during emergencies. The timing was deliberately chosen when harvests made payment possible, but before families could consume or hide their production. Preparation for winter involved countless tasks that would determine family survival through the cold months ahead. Fuel had to be gathered and stored, wood for heating and cooking, dried animal dung for supplemental fuel, anything combustible that could provide warmth during the long dark season ahead. Clothing and bedding needed repair or replacement. Food supplies required organization and protection. Houses needed weatherproofing to keep out winter's cold and moisture. Winter was the season that tested everything medieval peasants had accomplished during the rest of the year. It was the time when careful planning meant the difference between survival and disaster, when community bonds became literally vital to individual welfare, and when families lived off the fruits of their earlier labour while preparing for the cycle to begin again. Indoor activities dominated winter life as families spent most of their time in houses that became workshops, social centres, and survival shelters all in one. Women continued spinning thread and weaving cloth, work that provided both clothing for their families and goods that could be traded for other necessities. Men repaired tools, made new implements, and maintained equipment that would be needed when spring returned. Children learned adult skills through constant observation and participation in household work. Craft production reached its peak during winter months when outdoor agricultural work was impossible. Families who had specialized skills used this season to produce goods that could be traded throughout the community. Blacksmiths forged tools and hardware. Carpenters built furniture and repaired household items. Potters created vessels for cooking and storage. These activities weren't just economic. They were social interactions that kept communities connected during the isolating winter months. Storytelling became a central winter activity that served multiple important functions. Long evenings around fires provided opportunities for older generations to pass down knowledge, traditions, and values to younger family members. Stories weren't just entertainment, they were education, preserving practical information about farming, weather patterns, local history, and moral guidance that children would need as adults. These oral traditions connected medieval families to their ancestors and their community's shared identity. Religious observances took on special significance during winter, when communities needed spiritual comfort to endure physical hardships. Christmas celebrations provided light and joy during the darkest season. Saints' days offered occasions for community gatherings that broke the monotony of winter isolation. Religious services became social centres where families could maintain connections with neighbours and participate in shared rituals that reinforced community bonds. Community mutual support systems operated most intensively during winter, when individual families were most vulnerable. Neighbours shared resources, provided help during emergencies, and offered assistance to families facing particular hardships. These weren't formal charity programs, but reciprocal relationships, where everyone understood they might need help and should provide it when they could. Such networks often meant the difference between survival and catastrophe for vulnerable households. Food management became a constant concern during winter months, when families lived entirely off stored supplies. Meals were carefully planned to make preserved foods last until spring brought fresh sources of nutrition. Grain was ground into flour as needed rather than all at once, preserving its nutritional value and preventing spoilage. Families developed elaborate systems for rationing their supplies, ensuring that even the leanest months before spring harvest would have some food available. Winter also brought its own food sources that supplemented stored supplies. Hunting and trapping provided fresh meat when weather permitted. Ice fishing offered opportunities to catch fresh fish. Wild plants and roots could be gathered even in winter conditions. These supplemental foods weren't luxuries. They were essential additions to stored grain and preserved meat that helped families maintain nutrition through the difficult season. Planning for the next agricultural cycle began during winter months when families had time to think beyond immediate survival needs. Seeds were carefully examined and selected for spring planting. Tools were inventoried and repair needs identified. Crop rotations were planned based on the previous year's results and current soil conditions. Fields were mentally divided and allocated for different crops. This planning wasn't casual, it was strategic thinking that would determine the family's success in the coming year. The winter season also provided time for major decisions about family and community life. Marriages were often planned during winter months and celebrated in spring. Young people who would leave home to work for other families made their arrangements. Families discussed major investments like new tools, animals, or improvements to their homes. These decisions shaped the social and economic structure of communities for years to come. Weather watching became an essential winter skill as families learned to predict conditions that would affect their safety and survival. Reading cloud patterns, wind direction, animal behavior, and other natural signs helped peasants prepare for storms, plan travel, and make decisions about outdoor work. This wasn't folklore. It was practical meteorology based on generations of careful observation and passed down through families and communities. As winter gradually gave way to spring, families began preparing for the cycle to begin again. Equipment was organized and repaired. Seed stocks were prepared for planting. Animals were evaluated for their breeding potential. Houses and outbuildings were inspected for winter damage that needed repair. The endless wheel of agricultural life was ready to turn once more, carrying medieval families through another year of challenges, hopes, and survival. The seasonal cycle that governed medieval peasant life was far more than just agriculture. It was a complete system of living that integrated work with worship, individual effort with community cooperation, and human activity with natural rhythms. This way of life sustained European civilization for nearly 1,000 years, creating communities that were resilient, sustainable, and remarkably successful at maintaining human welfare within the constraints of their time and place. Understanding this agricultural cycle reveals why medieval villagers developed such strong community bonds, such detailed knowledge of their environment, and such sophisticated systems for managing resources and sharing risks. Their survival depended not just on individual effort, but on collective wisdom and mutual support that enabled entire communities to thrive despite challenges that would overwhelm modern people. The seasonal rhythm of their lives created a framework for existence that was both practical and meaningful, connecting daily work to larger purposes and individual welfare to community success. Modern society, with its artificial lighting, climate control, and global food systems, has largely disconnected from the seasonal rhythms that shaped human life for thousands of years. Yet the medieval agricultural cycle offers profound insights about sustainable living, community cooperation, and the deep satisfaction that comes from work that is both personally meaningful and essential to collective welfare. The peasants who followed this ancient rhythm weren't primitive people struggling to survive. They were sophisticated communities who had mastered the art of living in harmony with natural cycles while creating rich, fulfilling lives for themselves and their families. While the rhythms of planting and harvest shaped the framework of medieval village life, there was another force equally powerful that guided every aspect of peasant existence: faith. The Christian religion wasn't something medieval villagers practiced once a week on Sunday and then forgot about. It was woven into every moment of their lives, from the prayers they whispered upon waking to the bells that marked their daily activities, from the way they understood their place in the world to how they faced the ultimate mystery of death. At the physical and spiritual heart of every medieval village stood the parish church, a building that served far more purposes than any modern church ever could. This wasn't just a place where people went to pray. It was the beating heart of community life, the centre around which everything else revolved. The church building itself told the story of the village's priorities. While peasant homes were built from wood, mud, and thatch, the church was constructed from stone that would last for centuries. While individual houses might burn down or crumble, the church stood as the permanent centre that connected one generation to the next. The architecture of these medieval parish churches was designed to inspire and teach. Remember, most villagers couldn't read or write, so the church building itself became their book of instruction. Every stone carving, every painted wall, every piece of stained glass told stories from the Bible, or illustrated moral lessons about how to live a Christian life. The moment you walked through the heavy wooden doors, you entered a different world, one filled with colours and images that seemed to glow with divine light. The layout of the church reflected medieval understanding of sacred space and community hierarchy. The altar, where the priest performed the Mass, stood at the eastern end, oriented toward Jerusalem and the rising sun that symbolized Christ's resurrection. This was the most sacred area, separated from the rest of the church by a screen that emphasized the mystery and holiness of what took place there. The nave, where the congregation gathered, was divided by invisible but clearly understood social boundaries. Wealthy families had their designated areas, often marked by special pews or family chapels. Ordinary villagers stood or knelt on the stone floor, arranged according to their status within the community. But the church served many functions beyond religious services. During the week, it might serve as a courtroom where disputes were settled, a meeting hall where village business was conducted, or a school where children learned their letters from the priest. In times of danger, the thick stone walls and sturdy construction made the church the safest refuge in the village. When raiders threatened or storms raged, families would huddle together within its protective walls, trusting that this sacred space would shelter them from both earthly and spiritual dangers. The churchyard surrounding the building was equally important to village life. This was where the dead were buried, creating a constant reminder that life was temporary and that all earthly struggles would eventually end in God's judgment. But the churchyard was also where the living gathered after services to conduct business, share news, and maintain the social connections that held the community together. Children played among the graves, learning the names and stories of their ancestors while absorbing lessons about mortality that modern people rarely encounter. Weekly Mass was the central religious obligation that shaped the rhythm of medieval life. Every Sunday and on major holy days throughout the year, villagers gathered to participate in the miracle of the Eucharist, the transformation of bread and wine into the body and blood of Christ. For medieval peasants, this wasn't symbolic. It was literally true, a weekly miracle that brought them into direct contact with the divine. The Mass itself was conducted entirely in Latin, a language that most villagers didn't understand. But this wasn't seen as a barrier. It was part of the mystery and sanctity of the ritual. The priest's actions, the familiar words echoing through the stone building, the ringing of bells at the moment of consecration, all of these created an atmosphere of holiness that transcended the need for literal comprehension. Villagers participated through their presence, their prayers, and their deep faith that something miraculous was happening before their eyes. The priest who conducted these services occupied a unique and powerful position in village society. Unlike other village officials who answered to the lord of the manor, the priest's authority came directly from God through the church hierarchy. This gave him a degree of independence that could be crucial when villagers needed an advocate against secular authority. But the priest was also deeply integrated into village life in ways that might surprise us today. He depended on his parishioners for his living, sharing their hardships and celebrating their successes. He often served as the only literate person in the village, making him not just a spiritual guide, but also the keeper of records, the writer of letters, and the main connection to the wider world beyond the village boundaries. Confession was one of the most important and intimate aspects of medieval religious life. At least once a year, usually during Lent, every villager was required to confess their sins privately to the priest and receive absolution. This wasn't just a spiritual requirement, it was also a powerful form of social control. Through confession, the priest learned about conflicts within the community, moral failures that threatened social order, and secrets that might otherwise remain hidden. His guidance in assigning penance and his advice about how to make amends helped maintain harmony within the village while reinforcing Christian moral standards. The priest also provided spiritual guidance during life's most crucial moments. He baptized newborn babies, welcoming them into the Christian community and ensuring their salvation if they died young. He blessed marriages, transforming what might otherwise be simple economic arrangements into sacred unions blessed by God. He provided comfort to the sick and dying, offering last rites that prepared souls for their journey into the afterlife. And he conducted funeral services that helped the living cope with grief while affirming their faith in resurrection and eternal life. But the church was more than just a repository of spiritual services. It was also the keeper of community memory. Church records documented births, marriages, and deaths, creating the only permanent record of individual lives in a largely illiterate society. The priest might also keep records of local events, unusual weather, harvest failures, or other occurrences that affected the community. In this way, the church served as both the spiritual center and the historical archive of village life. The religious calendar that governed medieval life was far more complex and meaningful than the simple Sunday observance that characterizes modern Christianity. The medieval year was structured around a cycle of holy days, feast days, and seasons that connected earthly activities with spiritual significance. This calendar didn't just mark time, it gave meaning to the passage of days and seasons, helping villagers understand their place in God's plan for the world. The Christmas season, beginning with Advent and extending through Epiphany, coincided with the darkest months of winter, when outdoor work was limited and families spent long hours together indoors. This was a time for contemplation, storytelling, and strengthening family bonds. The celebration of Christ's birth brought light and hope into the darkest time of year, promising that spring would return and that God's love would sustain the community through the difficult winter months. Easter was perhaps the most important celebration of the medieval year, marking Christ's resurrection and the promise of eternal life for all believers. The timing of Easter, which varies each year based on lunar calculations, connected Christian observance with ancient rhythms of nature and agricultural cycles. The Easter season coincided with spring planting, making the themes of death and resurrection especially meaningful to people whose lives depended on seeds dying in the ground to produce new life. Between these major celebrations, the medieval calendar was filled with saints' days that honoured particular holy figures, and often coincided with seasonal activities or local needs. St. Bridget's Day in early February marked the beginning of spring and was associated with the protection of livestock and dairy production. St. George's Day in April celebrated the patron saint of England, and was often marked with festivities that welcomed the return of warm weather. St. John's Day in midsummer was celebrated with bonfires and festivities that honoured the longest day of the year. Each village often had its own patron saint whose feast day was celebrated with special enthusiasm. This local patron was believed to take particular interest in the community's welfare, interceding with God on behalf of the villagers and protecting them from harm. The patron saint's feast day became the most important local celebration of the year, combining religious observance with community festivities that might include special foods, games, dancing, and other entertainment that brought the entire village together. These religious celebrations weren't separate from daily life. They were integrated with seasonal activities and community needs in ways that made faith practical and relevant. Harvest festivals gave thanks to God for successful crops, while also providing opportunities for communities to share food and celebrate their collective achievements. Blessing ceremonies for fields, animals, and tools connected religious faith with agricultural activities, asking for divine protection and assistance in the work that sustained life. The medieval calendar also included periods of fasting and penance that balanced celebration with spiritual discipline. Lent, the 40 days before Easter, was a time of fasting, prayer, and self-examination that prepared believers for the joy of resurrection. Advent, the weeks before Christmas, included fasting and spiritual preparation for the celebration of Christ's birth. These periods of restraint made the feast days more meaningful, while also providing practical benefits during times of year when food supplies were naturally limited. Religious processions and pilgrimages connected individual villages with the broader Christian community, while reinforcing local faith and identity. Local processions might mark special occasions, carry relics through the village for blessing and protection, or seek divine intervention during times of crisis. Longer pilgrimages to regional shrines or famous holy sites offered opportunities for spiritual growth and adventure, while connecting villagers with the wider world of medieval Christianity. The moral framework provided by Christian teaching shaped every aspect of medieval village life, creating a comprehensive system of values and behaviours that governed how people treated each other and understood their place in the world. This wasn't just a matter of personal faith, it was a practical system of social organisation that helped communities function effectively while preparing individuals for eternal salvation. The Church's teachings about sin and virtue provided clear guidelines for behaviour that applied to every aspect of daily life. The 7 deadly sins, pride, greed, lust, envy, gluttony, wrath, and sloth, weren't just abstract concepts but practical warnings about attitudes and behaviours that could destroy both individual souls and community harmony. Pride could lead to conflicts and social disruption. Greed could undermine the cooperation essential to survival. Lust could destroy marriages and family stability. Each sin had real consequences for community welfare as well as individual salvation. The corresponding virtues, humility, charity, chastity, contentment, moderation, patience, and diligence, weren't just spiritual ideals but practical guidelines for behaviour that promoted community welfare. Humility helped maintain social harmony by preventing conflicts over status and position. Charity ensured that community members helped each other during times of need. Chastity protected marriage and family structures that were essential to social stability. These virtues weren't imposed from outside, but emerged from the practical wisdom of generations who had learned what behaviours promoted community survival and prosperity. The Church's teachings about social hierarchy provided religious justification for the feudal system, while also imposing moral obligations on those in positions of power. Lords were taught that their authority came from God, and that they would be held accountable for how they treated their subjects. Peasants were taught that accepting their station in life was a Christian virtue, but they were also taught that even the most powerful lords were equal before God and subject to divine judgment. This religious framework didn't eliminate social tensions, but it provided ways of understanding and managing them that helped maintain stability. The concept of divine justice assured peasants that earthly inequalities would be corrected in the afterlife, while the threat of divine punishment reminded lords that their power had limits and obligations. The Church's role as mediator in disputes provided a neutral authority that could resolve conflicts without violence or disruption to the community. Community enforcement of moral standards was a collective responsibility that involved everyone in the village. Since everyone's salvation was believed to depend partly on the moral health of the entire community, individuals had both the right and obligation to monitor and correct their neighbours' behaviour. This wasn't seen as intrusive but as necessary for collective spiritual welfare. Public penance for serious moral failures served multiple functions within the community. It provided opportunities for forgiveness and reconciliation that could heal relationships damaged by wrongdoing. It reinforced moral standards by demonstrating the consequences of violating community values, and it created opportunities for the community to come together in support of both the wrongdoer seeking redemption and the victim seeking justice and healing. The role of confession in social regulation was particularly important in small communities, where secrets were difficult to keep and conflicts could easily escalate into violence. The priest's knowledge of individual sins and conflicts gained through confession allowed him to provide guidance and intervention that could prevent small problems from becoming major disruptions. His authority to assign penance and grant absolution provided mechanisms for justice and reconciliation that supplemented but didn't replace secular law enforcement. The religious justification for social hierarchy also imposed real obligations on those in positions of authority. Lords who abused their power or failed to fulfill their obligations to their subjects were warned that they would face divine judgment. The Church's teaching that all souls were equal before God provided a counterbalance to earthly inequalities, while the concept of Christian duty imposed moral limits on the exercise of power. Death and the afterlife were constant concerns in medieval village life, where mortality rates were high and life expectancy was short compared to modern standards. But rather than being morbid preoccupations, medieval attitudes toward death were integrated into a comprehensive worldview that gave meaning to life's struggles while providing comfort and hope in the face of loss. The medieval understanding of death as a transition rather than an ending shaped how people prepared for this inevitable experience. A good death was one that occurred with proper spiritual preparation, surrounded by family and community, and blessed by the Church's sacraments. This ideal wasn't always achievable. People died suddenly in accidents, wars, or epidemics, but it provided a model that guided both individual preparation and community support for the dying. Preparation for death was a lifelong process that involved regular spiritual practices designed to keep the soul ready for its journey into eternity. Daily prayers, weekly mass attendance, annual confession, and acts of charity and penance were all seen as essential preparation for the moment when each individual would face God's judgment. This preparation wasn't morbid or fearful, but was integrated into daily life as natural and necessary maintenance of spiritual health. When death approached, the community rallied around the dying person and their family with support that was both practical and spiritual. Neighbours helped with necessary work, provided food and assistance, and maintained prayer vigils that assured the dying person they wouldn't face their final moments alone. The priest provided last rites that included final confession, communion, and anointing with holy oil, sacraments that prepared the soul for its journey, while providing comfort to both the dying person and their loved ones. Funeral customs reflected both grief at the loss of community members and faith in the promise of resurrection and eternal life. The body was prepared for burial by family members and neighbours, often with rituals that honoured the deceased while acknowledging the reality of death. The funeral service itself combined mourning with celebration, acknowledging loss while affirming faith that death was not the end but a transformation into eternal life with God. Burial practices reflected medieval beliefs about the connection between body and soul and the promise of bodily resurrection at the end of time. Bodies were buried in consecrated ground, usually in the churchyard, where they would wait for the final judgment when souls and bodies would be reunited. The location of graves within the churchyard often reflected social status, with wealthy families securing plots closer to the church building, but the shared burial ground emphasized the equality of all people before God. Medieval beliefs about purgatory provided a framework for understanding the afterlife that was both hopeful and practical. Rather than the simple heaven or hell division that characterizes some modern Christian thinking, medieval theology included purgatory as an intermediate state where souls could be purified of their sins through suffering and prayer. This belief made death less terrifying while also providing practical ways for the living to help deceased loved ones through prayers, masses, and charitable acts performed in their memory. Memorial services and prayers for the dead were ongoing community obligations that maintained connections between the living and the deceased, while reinforcing beliefs about the afterlife. Anniversary masses, special prayers during holy seasons, and charitable acts performed in memory of the dead all served to keep deceased community members present in village life while helping their souls progress toward heaven. Community support for bereaved families was both a practical necessity and a religious obligation. Death often left families economically vulnerable, especially when the deceased had been a primary breadwinner or essential worker. Community assistance with practical needs like childcare, farm work, or household management helped families survive the immediate crisis, while longer-term support helped them rebuild their lives. This assistance was seen not just as charity, but as a Christian duty that benefited both the givers and receivers. The integration of death into daily life through memorials, prayers, and ongoing community obligations meant that deceased family members and neighbours remained active parts of village consciousness. Their graves in the churchyard served as daily reminders of mortality and the hope of resurrection. Their memory was preserved through stories, prayers, and charitable acts that kept their influence alive within the community. And their anticipated reunion with living family members in heaven provided comfort and hope that made earthly separations bearable. This comprehensive approach to death and afterlife created a framework for understanding mortality that was both realistic and hopeful. Death was acknowledged as a natural part of life that everyone would eventually face, but it was also understood as a transition to a better existence for those who had lived faithfully and died well. The community's role in supporting both the dying and the bereaved created networks of mutual care that strengthened social bonds while affirming shared faith in God's love and justice. The spiritual framework that shaped medieval village life through the church, religious calendar, moral teachings, and beliefs about death created a comprehensive worldview that gave meaning to every aspect of existence. This wasn't just a matter of religious belief, but a practical system of social organization that helped communities function effectively while providing individuals with guidance, support, and hope in the face of life's challenges and uncertainties. Modern people often find it difficult to understand how deeply religion influenced every aspect of medieval life. But for villagers living in this world, faith wasn't separate from daily activities. It was the foundation that made everything else meaningful. The church building at the center of the village was both a symbol and a reality of God's presence in the community. The religious calendar that structured the year connected seasonal activities with spiritual significance. The moral teachings that guided behavior created a framework for social harmony and individual salvation, and the beliefs about death and afterlife provided hope and comfort that made earthly struggles endurable. This integration of faith with every aspect of life created communities that were remarkably resilient and cohesive. When disasters struck, whether famines, epidemics, wars, or natural catastrophes, villages had both practical systems of mutual support and spiritual resources that helped them endure and recover. When individuals faced personal crises, illness, death of loved ones, economic hardship, or moral failures, they had access to both community assistance and spiritual guidance that provided pathways to healing and hope. The medieval synthesis of faith and daily life wasn't perfect. It could be oppressive as well as supportive, rigid as well as comforting, but it created a framework for human community that sustained millions of people through centuries of challenges while providing meaning, purpose, and hope that made difficult lives not just bearable, but often fulfilling and joyful. Understanding this spiritual framework is essential to appreciating how medieval villagers created communities that were both practical and profound, both earthly and eternal. While faith provided the spiritual framework that guided medieval village life, it was the daily work of countless hands that actually kept these communities alive and thriving. Every sunrise brought a new day of labor, innovation, and cooperation that sustained families through the changing seasons. The economic system that medieval villagers created wasn't just about survival. It was an intricate web of skills, knowledge, and relationships that connected every person to the prosperity of their community. Understanding how these villages actually functioned as economic units reveals something remarkable about human ingenuity. Without modern machinery, chemical fertilizers, or global supply chains, medieval peasants developed techniques and systems that supported millions of people for centuries. They weren't just scratching out a bare existence. They were building sustainable communities that produced everything from basic necessities to luxury goods, all while maintaining the delicate balance between human needs and environmental resources. The heart of any medieval village's economy was agriculture, but this wasn't the simple farming that many people imagine. Medieval peasants were sophisticated agricultural scientists who had spent generations perfecting techniques that maximized their harvests while preserving the land for future use. They understood principles of soil management, crop rotation, and sustainable farming that modern agriculture is only beginning to rediscover. The three-field system represented one of the most brilliant innovations in medieval agriculture. Instead of just randomly planting crops wherever they felt like it, villagers divided their arable land into 3 large sections. Each year they would plant one field with winter crops like wheat or rye, another with spring crops like barley, oats, or legumes, and leave the third field fallow to restore its fertility. The following year they would rotate these assignments, ensuring that every piece of land got regular rest while still producing food every season. This wasn't just good farming, it was genius-level resource management. The fallow field wasn't truly empty, it was used for grazing animals whose manure fertilized the soil naturally. Legume crops actually improved soil fertility by fixing nitrogen from the air, something medieval farmers understood practically even if they didn't know the science behind it. The system also spread risk across multiple crops and seasons, so if one harvest failed, the community wouldn't face complete starvation. The technology behind medieval farming was far more sophisticated than popular images of primitive peasants suggest. The heavy-wheeled plough, drawn by teams of oxen or horses, could turn the thick, clay-rich soils of northern Europe that lighter Mediterranean ploughs couldn't handle. These massive implements required community cooperation since few families could afford a complete plough team. But they opened up vast areas of fertile land that had never been farmed before. Medieval blacksmiths constantly improved these tools, developing iron ploughshares that could cut through tough soil, clutters that sliced vertically through the earth before the ploughshare turned it over, and mould boards that shaped the furrow perfectly for the local soil conditions. Each plough was essentially a custom-engineered precision instrument, designed specifically for its village's unique combination of soil, climate, and crops. The choice between oxen and horses for pulling these ploughs reflected sophisticated economic calculations. Oxen were stronger, cheaper to feed, and could be eaten when they got too old to work, but they moved slowly and needed more rest. Horses worked faster and could pull lighter loads more efficiently, but they required expensive oats for feed and special iron horseshoes. Villages that could afford horse teams gained significant advantages in ploughing speed and overall agricultural productivity. Water management represented another area where medieval peasants demonstrated remarkable engineering skills. They built complex systems of drainage ditches to remove excess water from low-lying fields, preventing the waterlogging that could destroy entire harvests. In drier regions, they constructed irrigation channels that brought water from streams and rivers to fields that needed moisture. These systems required constant maintenance and sophisticated cooperation between villages sharing the same water sources. Medieval farmers were also skilled plant breeders who gradually improved their crops through careful seed selection. They saved seeds only from their best plants, those that produced the highest yields, resisted diseases, or ripened at optimal times. Over generations, this selective breeding produced varieties of wheat, barley, rye, and other crops that were specifically adapted to local growing conditions. Some villages developed such superior seed stock that their grain commanded premium prices at regional markets. Tool maintenance and development occupied a central place in village economic life. Every family needed a complex array of specialized implements: plows, harrows, sickles, scythes, flails, winnowing baskets, and dozens of other tools for specific agricultural tasks. These weren't mass-produced items, but carefully crafted instruments that could last for decades with proper care. Village blacksmiths worked closely with farmers to design tools perfectly suited to local conditions, creating a constant cycle of innovation and improvement. Beyond agriculture, medieval villages functioned as centers of craft production that created everything their residents needed and much of what neighboring communities wanted to buy. Every village had its complement of skilled artisans whose expertise transformed raw materials into finished goods that made life possible and comfortable. The village blacksmith occupied a position of special importance in this craft economy. Working at his forge, he created and maintained the iron tools that everyone depended on: ploughshares and harrow teeth, sickles and scythes, axes and hammers, nails and hinges, horseshoes and cart fittings. But medieval blacksmiths were far more than simple metal workers. They were metallurgists who understood how different heating and cooling techniques could produce iron with varying degrees of hardness and flexibility. They were engineers who designed complex mechanisms like mill wheels and clockworks. They were artists who decorated their functional items with beautiful patterns and designs. The blacksmith's workshop buzzed with activity throughout the year. During planting season, he might repair dozens of ploughshares worn down by rocky soil. At harvest time, he'd sharpen scythes and sickles that had to cut cleanly through countless stalks of grain. In winter, when outdoor work slowed down, he could focus on crafting the complex items that required patience and precision: elaborate locks, decorative metalwork, or specialized tools for other craftsmen. Village carpenters were equally essential artisans who worked with the wood that provided building material, fuel, and countless household items. These weren't just rough laborers who chopped down trees and hammered them together. Medieval carpenters were sophisticated woodworkers who understood the properties of different tree species, the techniques for seasoning lumber properly, and the joinery methods that could create structures lasting for centuries. A skilled carpenter could build everything from a simple stool to a complex windmill, from a peasant's cottage to a lord's manor house. He understood how to select trees with the right grain patterns for specific uses, how to cut lumber to minimize waste and maximize strength, and how to join pieces together without using metal fasteners that were expensive and prone to rust. The wooden structures these craftsmen created, houses, barns, churches, bridges, formed the physical infrastructure of medieval civilization. Pottery production provided another essential village industry. Clay vessels weren't luxuries but necessities for storing, cooking, and serving food. The village potter needed to understand the chemistry of different clays, the temperatures required for proper firing, and the glazing techniques that made pots waterproof and durable. A potter's workshop would contain dozens of different vessels: cooking pots and storage jars, serving bowls and drinking cups, specialized containers for everything from brewing beer to preserving eggs. The textile industry represented perhaps the most complex and valuable form of village craft production. Creating cloth from raw materials required a long chain of specialized skills and tools. Sheep had to be sheared, their wool cleaned and sorted by quality. Flax had to be harvested, retted in water to separate the fibers, then processed through multiple stages of breaking, scutching, and combing before it could be spun into thread. Spinning itself was a highly skilled craft that transformed loose fibers into the strong, even threads needed for weaving. This work was primarily done by women, who could spin while walking, talking, or watching children, using spindles and later spinning wheels to create the miles of thread needed for a single piece of cloth. The finest spinners could produce thread so even and strong that it commanded premium prices from weavers who needed high-quality materials for their best work. Weaving transformed thread into cloth through techniques that range from simple to incredibly complex. A village weaver working at a floor loom could create basic fabrics for everyday clothing and household use, but skilled weavers could produce elaborate patterns and textures that rivaled anything made in urban workshops. The best village weavers developed signature patterns and techniques that made their cloth recognizable throughout the region. Food processing represented another crucial category of village craft production. Grain had to be ground into flour, a task that required either the muscle power of human workers using hand querns or the mechanical advantage of water-powered or windmill wheels. Village millers were essential figures who controlled this vital service, often working under license from the local lord who owned the expensive mill machinery. Brewing was equally important since ale provided a safe alternative to water that might be contaminated with disease. Village brewers, often women known as alewives, needed to understand the fermentation process that converted grain into alcoholic beverages. They had to maintain consistent quality while working with ingredients that varied from season to season, and they often developed special recipes that gave their products distinctive flavors. Baking bread required specialized ovens that individual families couldn't afford to build and maintain. Village bakers operated these communal facilities, often located in the most fire-safe part of town, where families could bring their prepared dough to be baked properly. A skilled baker could judge oven temperatures by feel, regulate the firing process to create the intense heat needed for proper bread, and manage the complex scheduling required when dozens of families needed baking services at the same time. Medieval villages weren't isolated, self-sufficient communities, but active participants in trade networks that connected them to the broader medieval economy. Understanding how these trade relationships worked reveals the sophisticated commercial knowledge that medieval peasants possessed and the economic opportunities they created for themselves. Market days transformed villages from quiet agricultural communities into bustling commercial centres where people from miles around would gather to buy, sell, and exchange goods. These weren't casual affairs, but carefully organised events that followed established schedules and rules. A village might hold its market every Wednesday, while neighbouring communities held theirs on different days, creating a regional network where merchants and customers could participate in multiple markets throughout the week. The variety of goods available at village markets would surprise many modern people who imagine medieval peasants as desperately poor. Yes, people came to buy and sell basic necessities like grain, vegetables, and simple tools, but they also traded in luxury items that made life more pleasant and comfortable. Fine cloth, spices, decorative metalwork, imported ceramics, and specialized foods that couldn't be produced locally. Village producers developed sophisticated strategies for participating in these markets. They learned to time their production cycles to take advantage of seasonal price variations, storing goods when prices were low and selling when demand pushed prices higher. They developed specializations that gave them competitive advantages, producing higher quality versions of common goods, creating unique products that weren't available elsewhere, or developing efficient production methods that allowed them to undersell competitors. Surplus production became a major source of income for successful village families. A peasant household might grow extra grain beyond their own needs, raise additional chickens for egg production, or develop particular skills in textile production that allowed them to create goods specifically for sale rather than household use. This surplus production required careful planning and risk management, since families had to ensure they met their own needs before committing resources to market production. The interaction between village producers and travelling merchants created opportunities for both local economic growth and connection to distant markets. Merchants would visit villages on regular schedules, buying local products that could be sold profitably in other regions while bringing goods that villagers wanted but couldn't produce themselves. These relationships often involved credit arrangements, seasonal contracts, and other sophisticated commercial agreements that required considerable business skill from both parties. Currency use in village markets reflected the complexity of medieval commercial relationships. While many transactions involved direct barter, exchanging goods for other goods without using money, cash payments became increasingly common as commercial activity expanded. Villages needed people who understood currency values, exchange rates, and the reliability of coins from different regions. This knowledge became particularly important when dealing with travelling merchants who might offer payment in unfamiliar currencies. The connections between villages and nearby towns created economic opportunities that benefited both urban and rural communities. Towns needed the food, raw materials, and craft products that villages produced, while villages needed the specialized goods and services that only urban craftsmen and merchants could provide. These relationships involved regular trade flows, credit arrangements, and economic dependencies that made rural and urban communities partners in regional economic development. Regional fairs represented the highest level of commercial activity that most villages participated in. These annual or seasonal events brought together merchants, craftsmen, and customers from vast areas, creating temporary commercial cities where people could buy and sell goods unavailable in local markets. Village producers who wanted to participate in these fairs had to plan their production cycles months in advance, creating goods specifically designed for these premium markets where quality and uniqueness commanded the highest prices. The economic life of medieval villages operated within a complex framework of obligations and payments that connected local production to broader political and religious institutions. Understanding these obligations reveals how village economies supported not just their own residents, but also the lords, churches, and kingdoms that provided government, military protection, and spiritual services. Labour service on the lord's domain represented one of the most significant economic obligations that villagers faced. The domain consisted of those portions of the manor that the lord kept under his direct control, rather than granting to peasant families. Peasants owed specific amounts of work on these lands, perhaps 2 or 3 days per week during busy seasons, or a set number of days per year for particular tasks like ploughing, harvesting, or construction projects. This labour service wasn't arbitrary exploitation, but part of a complex economic arrangement that provided benefits to both lords and peasants. Lords received the workers they needed to manage large agricultural operations efficiently, while peasants gained access to land, protection, and economic opportunities they couldn't have achieved independently. The timing and nature of labour service were carefully regulated to ensure that peasants could still manage their own farms effectively. Rent payments in kind and cash supplemented labour service as ways that peasants compensated lords for their use of land and other resources. These payments might include fixed amounts of grain, livestock, or other agricultural products delivered at specific times of the year. As money became more common in village economies, cash rents gradually replaced or supplemented payments in kind, giving both lords and peasants more flexibility in managing their economic relationships. Church tithes represented another major economic obligation that connected village production to religious institutions. The principle of tithing, giving 1/10 of agricultural production to support the church, was deeply embedded in medieval religious belief, but its practical implementation required sophisticated systems for assessment, collection, and distribution. Villages needed officials who could accurately measure harvests, determine appropriate tithe amounts, and coordinate the physical delivery of goods to church authorities. Royal taxes and extraordinary levies added another layer of economic obligation that could significantly impact village prosperity. Kings needed revenues to fund their governments, maintain armies, and undertake major projects like castle construction or military campaigns. These needs created tax demands that filtered down through the feudal hierarchy to village level, where local officials had to assess and collect payments from peasant families whose economic resources were already stretched by other obligations. Village collective responsibilities created another category of economic burden that required community cooperation and resource pooling. Villages might be collectively responsible for maintaining roads and bridges, contributing to regional defence projects, or providing hospitality for travelling royal officials. These obligations required sophisticated systems of community decision-making and resource management that ensured burdens were shared fairly among families with different economic capabilities. The economic impact of these various obligations was enormous, often claiming 30–50% of village agricultural production. Yet this wasn't simply economic exploitation. The services that lords, churches, and kings provided in return, military protection, legal systems, spiritual guidance, infrastructure development, were genuinely valuable to village communities that couldn't have provided these services for themselves. Managing these multiple obligations required considerable economic sophistication from village communities. They needed to coordinate their production cycles to ensure they could meet all their commitments, while still maintaining their own families. They had to understand the complex legal and customary arrangements that governed different types of payments. They needed systems for fairly distributing collective obligations among community members with varying economic resources. The timing of different obligations throughout the year created additional management challenges. Harvest time brought intensive demands for both labour service and rent payments, just when villagers were busiest with their own agricultural needs. Church tithes were due at specific religious holidays that might not align with optimal economic timing. Royal tax collectors could appear with little warning, demanding immediate payment regardless of local economic conditions. Despite these challenges, successful village communities developed strategies that allowed them to meet their obligations while still achieving economic growth and improved living standards. They learned to plan production cycles that maximized efficiency and minimized conflicts between different commitments. They developed community institutions that could negotiate with external authorities and advocate for reasonable treatment. Most importantly, they created economic systems that generated enough prosperity to support not just their own needs, but also the broader medieval civilization of which they were an essential part. The economic complexity of medieval village life reveals that these communities were far from the primitive agricultural settlements that popular stereotypes suggest. They were sophisticated economic units that successfully balanced individual family needs with community obligations, local production with regional trade networks, traditional methods with continuous innovation, and immediate survival with long-term sustainability. Their achievements in creating prosperous, resilient communities under challenging conditions offer valuable lessons about human economic creativity and the importance of balancing individual initiative with collective responsibility. The villagers who created and maintained these economic systems weren't just trying to survive from one season to the next. They were building foundations for families and communities that could thrive across generations, creating the economic prosperity that supported the remarkable cultural achievements of medieval civilization. Their success in doing so, despite the limitations of their technology and the burdens of their obligations, stands as testimony to human ingenuity and the power of communities working together toward common goals. This economic framework, combining agricultural innovation, skilled craft production, active participation in trade networks, and careful management of external obligations, provided the foundation for everything else that made medieval village life possible. Without understanding how these economic systems actually worked, we can't appreciate the remarkable achievement these communities represented, or the valuable lessons they offer for our own efforts to create sustainable, prosperous communities in the modern world. While understanding the economic systems that sustained medieval villages reveals how these communities survived, it's the intricate web of human relationships that shows us how they actually thrived. Beyond the daily work of farming and crafts, beyond the careful management of resources and obligations, lay the beating heart of village life, the complex social world where people fell in love, raised families, settled disputes, celebrated together, and navigated the countless small conflicts that arise whenever humans live in close quarters. Medieval village society wasn't the simple, harmonious community that romantic images sometimes suggest. It was a vibrant, sometimes turbulent world where people who knew each other from birth had to find ways to live together through good times and bad, where individual desires had to be balanced against community needs, and where ancient traditions constantly bumped up against the practical realities of daily survival. Understanding these social relationships reveals the human side of medieval life that statistics about grain production and tax obligations can never capture. At the heart of every medieval village lay families, not just the nuclear families we know today, but extended networks of relatives that could include 3 or 4 generations living within a few hundred yards of each other. Marriage wasn't just a personal choice between 2 individuals, but a community event that affected property ownership, work arrangements, and social relationships throughout the village. Understanding how medieval people approached marriage and family life reveals the careful balance they maintained between individual happiness and collective welfare. Courtship in medieval villages followed patterns that would seem both familiar and strange to modern people. Young people certainly fell in love, but their romantic feelings had to navigate a complex landscape of practical considerations that could make or break a potential match. A young man interested in a particular girl couldn't simply ask her out on a date. Instead, he had to consider whether his family's economic situation could support a wife, whether her family would welcome his suit, and whether the proposed match would strengthen or complicate relationships within the broader community. Parents played a central role in arranging marriages, but this wasn't the tyrannical control that modern stereotypes suggest. Most parents wanted their children to be happy, but they also understood that a bad marriage could spell economic disaster for everyone involved. A father looking for a husband for his daughter would consider not just which young men could support her, but which ones would treat her well, which families would welcome her as a daughter-in-law, and which matches would create useful alliances between households. The actual process of courtship often began at community gatherings, harvest festivals, church celebrations, market days, or seasonal work parties where young people from different families could meet and get to know each other under the watchful eyes of their elders. A young man might show his interest through small gifts, offers to help with family work, or simply by finding reasons to be near the object of his affection. If both families approved of the developing relationship, more formal negotiations would begin. Marriage negotiations involved detailed discussions about what each family would contribute to the new household. The bride's family typically provided a dowry, money, goods, or property that would help the couple establish their independent life together. The groom's family might contribute tools, livestock, or land that would enable the young man to support his wife. These weren't cold business transactions, but careful plans to give the new couple the best possible chance of success in a world where economic failure could mean starvation. Wedding celebrations transformed these practical arrangements into joyous community events that strengthened the social bonds holding villages together. A typical wedding celebration might last for several days, with the entire community contributing food, entertainment, and good wishes for the new couple. These weren't expensive displays of wealth, but collective celebrations where everyone's contribution, whether a loaf of bread, a song, or help with preparations, expressed the community's investment in the marriage's success. The wedding ceremony itself usually took place at the church door, where the couple would exchange vows in the presence of witnesses before entering the building for a blessing from the priest. This public ceremony ensured that everyone understood the terms of the marriage contract and could serve as witnesses if disputes arose later. After the religious ceremony, the celebration would move to the village green, or a family's yard for feasting, dancing, and traditional rituals that welcomed the new couple into their changed status within the community. Marriage created new economic partnerships that extended far beyond romantic companionship. A medieval wife wasn't just her husband's emotional companion, but his business partner in the complex enterprise of running a household that might include farming, crafts production, childcare, food processing, and countless other activities essential to family survival. Successful marriages required both partners to master their respective roles while maintaining the flexibility to help each other when circumstances demanded it. Women in medieval villages enjoyed more legal rights and practical authority than popular stereotypes suggest. A married woman could own property, conduct business, and make contracts in her own name under certain circumstances. If her husband died, she might inherit substantial property and take over the family's economic activities. Many widows became some of the most successful entrepreneurs in their villages, using the skills they'd developed during marriage to build independent businesses that supported their children and contributed to community prosperity. Child rearing in medieval villages was a community responsibility that extended far beyond the immediate family. While parents held primary responsibility for their children's upbringing, neighbours, relatives, and family friends all played important roles in teaching young people the skills, values, and knowledge they would need as adults. Children grew up surrounded by adults who knew their families, understood their personalities, and took active interest in their development. Education happened primarily through apprenticeship and observation rather than formal schooling. Boys learned agricultural techniques, craft skills, and business practices by working alongside their fathers, uncles, and other men in the community. Girls learned household management, textile production, food preparation, and childcare by helping their mothers, aunts, and older sisters with daily tasks. This hands-on approach meant that children developed practical skills from an early age while absorbing the values and traditions that held their communities together. Children weren't considered miniature adults, but they also weren't sheltered from the realities of life in the way that modern children often are. By age 7 or 8, most village children were making real contributions to their family's welfare through age-appropriate work. By 12 or 14, they were taking on substantial responsibilities that would prepare them for their eventual roles as independent adults. This early involvement in productive activities wasn't exploitation, but preparation for a world where everyone's contribution mattered. Inheritance customs reflected the careful balance medieval communities maintained between individual rights and collective welfare. Most villages followed systems that prevented the division of family land into parcels too small to support a household, typically by passing the main inheritance to the eldest son, while providing other children with smaller inheritances, or help establishing themselves in crafts or other occupations. These arrangements weren't always fair by modern standards, but they helped maintain economic stability within village communities. When family inheritance wasn't enough to establish all children in independent livelihoods, villages developed various strategies for helping young adults find their places in the world. Some young people moved to other villages where land or opportunities were available. Others apprenticed with craftsmen who could teach them specialized skills. Still others found positions as servants or laborers in wealthier households where they could earn money while learning useful skills. These arrangements required considerable coordination between families and communities to ensure that young people found appropriate situations. Medieval villages weren't governed by distant bureaucrats or elected officials, but by complex systems of collective decision-making that involved most adult members of the community in managing their shared affairs. Understanding how these systems worked reveals the sophisticated political skills that ordinary medieval people developed to maintain harmony and resolve conflicts in communities where everyone knew everyone else's business. Village assemblies provided the primary forum for community decision-making, typically meeting several times per year to address issues affecting the entire settlement. These weren't formal legislative bodies with written procedures, but gatherings where villagers could discuss problems, propose solutions, and reach consensus about how to handle shared challenges. The assembly might meet in the church, at the village green, or in someone's large barn with attendance expected from all heads of households and encouraged for other adults who might have useful perspectives. The range of issues addressed by village assemblies was remarkably broad, covering everything from agricultural planning to conflict resolution to preparations for seasonal celebrations. The assembly might decide when to begin planting, how to allocate grazing rights on common lands, what repairs needed to be made to shared facilities like mills or bridges, or how to respond to demands from outside authorities for taxes or military service. These decisions required balancing competing interests and finding solutions that the community could support collectively. Decision-making in village assemblies relied on discussion and consensus rather than formal voting procedures. Issues would be presented and discussed until the community reached general agreement about how to proceed. This process could be time-consuming and sometimes frustrating, but it ensured that decisions had broad support and that everyone understood their roles in implementing whatever was decided. The emphasis on consensus also meant that minority viewpoints received consideration, and that solutions typically tried to address the concerns of different groups within the community. Leadership in village assemblies emerged naturally from the community rather than being imposed from outside. Respected elders, successful farmers, skilled craftsmen and others with demonstrated judgment and communication skills would naturally take more active roles in discussions. However, this informal leadership was balanced by the expectation that everyone could contribute to discussions and that decisions needed broad community support to be effective. The Manor Court provided another important venue for community governance, handling legal disputes and administrative matters that fell under the Lord's jurisdiction. Unlike village assemblies, which operated through consensus, manor courts followed more formal legal procedures with the Lord or his representative serving as judge. However, these courts relied heavily on local knowledge and community input, often using juries of villagers to determine facts and recommend appropriate responses to various disputes. Manor courts handled a wide variety of cases, from property disputes between neighbours to violations of agricultural regulations to more serious matters like theft or assault. The court might rule on boundary disputes between farmers, determine compensation for damaged crops, settle disagreements about inheritance, or impose penalties for violations of community standards. These proceedings provided formal mechanisms for resolving conflicts that couldn't be settled through informal discussion. The effectiveness of manor courts depended on their ability to balance legal procedures with community knowledge and values. Judges who ignored local customs or imposed solutions that violated community standards would face resistance and could undermine the entire system of local governance. Successful manor courts worked with village leaders to understand the context behind disputes and to craft solutions that addressed underlying problems rather than just imposing penalties. Conflict resolution in medieval villages relied on a combination of formal legal procedures and informal social pressure to maintain harmony within communities where people had to live and work together, regardless of their personal feelings about each other. Understanding how villagers handled disputes reveals their sophisticated understanding of human psychology and their commitment to finding solutions that preserved community relationships while addressing legitimate grievances. Most conflicts began with informal attempts at resolution, with family members, friends, or respected community members trying to help disputants reach agreement before problems escalated into formal legal proceedings. These informal mediators might help clarify misunderstandings, suggest compromises, or simply provide neutral ground where angry parties could discuss their differences without losing face. The goal wasn't necessarily to determine who was right or wrong, but to find solutions that would allow everyone to continue living together peacefully. When informal resolution failed, communities had various mechanisms for escalating disputes while still maintaining hope for eventual reconciliation. Public discussions at village assemblies might air grievances and allow community input on appropriate solutions. Religious authorities might provide moral guidance and encourage forgiveness. Economic pressure, such as refusing to trade with someone who wouldn't resolve disputes fairly, could encourage cooperation without resorting to formal legal action. Despite the cooperative spirit that characterized much of village life, medieval communities also had to manage significant social tensions arising from economic inequality, generational differences, gender roles, and conflicts between insiders and outsiders. Understanding these tensions reveals the challenges ordinary people faced in maintaining community harmony, while dealing with the very human problems of jealousy, resentment, and conflicting interests. Economic inequality created some of the most persistent tensions in village life, as families with more land, better tools, or successful businesses enjoyed advantages that could seem unfair to their less fortunate neighbours. Wealthy peasants might own several strips of land in the best locations, maintain larger livestock herds, and afford better tools that increased their productivity and income. These advantages could compound over time, allowing successful families to accumulate even more resources while others struggled to meet basic subsistence needs. The gap between wealthy peasants and poor labourers could create resentment and social friction that threatened community harmony. Poor families might resent having to work for their more prosperous neighbours, especially during busy seasons when labour was in high demand and wealthy farmers could afford to pay higher wages. Rich peasants, meanwhile, might look down on their poorer neighbours and resist sharing community resources or supporting collective projects that didn't directly benefit their interests. Villages developed various strategies for managing economic inequality, and preventing it from destroying social cohesion. Wealthy families were expected to contribute more to community projects and to provide help during emergencies, creating informal systems of redistribution that prevented extreme hardship. Religious teachings emphasized the temporary nature of earthly wealth and the importance of charity and mutual support. Community traditions like harvest celebrations and religious festivals brought people together across economic lines and reinforced shared values. Generational conflicts added another layer of complexity to village social dynamics, as older and younger residents often had different perspectives on everything from farming techniques to social customs to relations with outside authorities. Elderly villagers might resist changes that threatened traditions they had spent lifetimes mastering, while younger people might chafe at restrictions that seemed outdated or unnecessarily limiting. These generational tensions could affect decisions about everything from agricultural innovation to marriage customs to community governance. The balance between respecting elder wisdom and adapting to changing circumstances required careful negotiation in communities where both young and old had important contributions to make. Elders possessed invaluable knowledge about local conditions, proven techniques, and successful responses to past challenges that could be crucial during difficult times. Young adults brought energy, new ideas, and different perspectives that could help communities adapt to changing conditions. Finding ways to combine these strengths while managing inevitable disagreements was an ongoing challenge for village leaders. Gender roles created another source of social tension, as medieval communities struggled to balance traditional expectations about men's and women's roles with the practical realities of village life that often required flexibility and cooperation across gender lines. While most villages had clear expectations about men's and women's work, actual practice often blurred these boundaries when circumstances demanded it. Women might take over agricultural work when men were absent, while men might help with household tasks during busy seasons or family emergencies. The status of women in medieval villages was more complex and varied than simple generalizations can capture. Some women enjoyed considerable authority and independence, especially widows who inherited property and ran their own businesses. Others found their options severely limited by social expectations, economic constraints, or family circumstances. Understanding women's actual experiences requires looking beyond formal rules to examine how individual women navigated the opportunities and limitations of their particular situations. Unmarried women face particular challenges in communities organized around family units and marriage partnerships. Young women who didn't marry might remain in their parents' households, working to support the family while having limited opportunities for independence. Older unmarried women might struggle to support themselves and could become dependent on relatives or community charity. However, some single women found ways to establish independent lives through specialized skills, business ventures, or religious vocations that provided alternatives to traditional marriage and family roles. The treatment of outsiders revealed another dimension of village social dynamics, as communities had to balance welcoming newcomers who could contribute useful skills or resources against protecting their existing members' interests and maintaining social stability. Villages needed to attract new residents to replace those lost to disease, migration, or other causes. But they also had to be careful about admitting people who might disrupt established relationships or compete unfairly for limited resources. Successful integration of outsiders required careful assessment of their skills, character, and likely impact on community dynamics. A skilled craftsman who could provide useful services might be welcomed enthusiastically, while a stranger with unclear motivations might face suspicion and resistance. The process of acceptance often took years and required newcomers to demonstrate their commitment to community values and their willingness to contribute to collective welfare. Resistance to authority created ongoing tensions between villagers and the various outside powers that claimed authority over their lives and resources. While communities generally accepted the basic structure of feudal obligations, they often resisted specific demands that seemed excessive, unfair, or contrary to local customs and interests. This resistance might take the form of passive non-compliance, formal appeals to higher authorities, or occasionally more direct confrontation when grievances became severe enough to justify the risks involved. Despite the hard work and serious challenges that dominated much of village life, medieval communities also created rich traditions of celebration, entertainment, and leisure that brought people together, relieved the pressures of daily survival, and reinforced the social bonds that held communities together. Understanding these lighter aspects of village life reveals the creativity, humour, and joy that medieval people brought to their lives even under difficult circumstances. Seasonal celebrations provided the framework for much of village social life, marking important transitions in the agricultural year while creating opportunities for community gathering and shared enjoyment. These weren't just religious observances, but complex events that combined spiritual significance with practical functions and pure entertainment in ways that strengthened community relationships while providing relief from routine work. Spring festivals celebrated the renewal of life and the beginning of another growing season, often incorporating both Christian religious elements and older traditions connected to agricultural cycles. May Day celebrations might include decorating the village with flowers and greenery, dancing around a maypole and crowning a May Queen chosen from among the young women of the community. These festivities provided opportunities for young people to socialize and for the entire community to express hope and optimism about the coming year. Summer celebrations often focused on religious holidays like Midsummer's Eve, which combined Christian observances with traditional bonfires, dancing, and nighttime festivities that brought the community together during the longest days of the year. These celebrations might include processions through the village, special foods prepared only for the occasion, and entertainment that continued well into the night. The timing of summer festivals often coincided with brief lulls in agricultural work, providing rare opportunities for extended celebration. Harvest festivals represented the year's most important celebrations, marking the successful completion of the agricultural cycle and providing occasions for thanksgiving, feasting, and community-wide parties that could last for several days. These celebrations typically began with religious services giving thanks for the harvest, followed by communal feasts featuring the best foods the community could provide. The abundant food available after harvest made these the most elaborate meals of the year, with families contributing their finest dishes to shared celebrations. Harvest festivals also provided opportunities for various forms of entertainment and competition that brought the community together while showcasing individual skills and talents. Contests might include everything from tests of strength and agility to demonstrations of craft skills to competitions in singing, dancing, or storytelling. These events allowed people to display their abilities while providing entertainment for spectators and creating friendly rivalries that added excitement to community life. Winter celebrations helped communities endure the darkest and most difficult months of the year by creating occasions for gathering, sharing resources, and maintaining social connections when outdoor work was limited and families might otherwise become isolated. Christmas celebrations often extended for 12 days, providing a series of opportunities for visiting, feasting, and entertainment during the period when agricultural work was at its minimum. Religious festivals throughout the year provided additional occasions for community celebration, while reinforcing the spiritual beliefs and values that gave meaning to village life. Saints' days might be observed with special church services followed by community gatherings, processions, or other activities that brought people together. These religious celebrations often incorporated local traditions and customs that gave each community's observances distinctive characteristics, while maintaining connections to broader Christian traditions. Folk traditions and customary practices created another layer of community entertainment and social bonding, preserving ancient knowledge while providing frameworks for collective celebration. Traditional dances, songs, stories, and games passed down through generations created shared cultural experiences that connected villagers to their ancestors while providing entertainment and education for each new generation. Traditional music played an important role in village social life, providing entertainment during celebrations while also serving practical functions like coordinating work rhythms and preserving cultural knowledge. Village musicians might include people with specialized skills on instruments like pipes, drums, or stringed instruments, but community singing was common and required no special training or equipment. Work songs helped coordinate group activities like harvesting or construction, while celebratory songs marked special occasions and helped create festive atmospheres. Dancing provided both entertainment and social interaction, allowing people of different ages and social levels to participate in shared activities that required cooperation and created opportunities for socialization. Traditional dances often told stories, celebrated seasonal changes, or enacted symbolic dramas that preserved cultural knowledge while providing physical exercise and social bonding. The learning and performance of traditional dances helped transmit cultural values, while creating inclusive activities that welcomed participation from most community members. Games and sports provided competitive entertainment, while also serving as training for skills that had practical applications in daily life. Archery contests helped men maintain skills that were important for hunting and defense, while wrestling or other tests of strength provided both entertainment and conditioning. Board games, dice games, and various forms of gambling offered indoor entertainment during long winter evenings, while creating social interactions that helped maintain community relationships during periods of limited outdoor activity. Storytelling preserved cultural knowledge while providing entertainment that required no special equipment or facilities beyond a gathering of interested listeners. Traditional tales might include historical accounts of local events, moral stories that taught important values, humorous anecdotes that provided entertainment, or epic narratives that connected local communities to broader cultural traditions. Skilled storytellers were valued members of their communities, providing education and entertainment while preserving cultural knowledge for future generations. The preservation of oral culture through storytelling, music, and traditional practices was crucial for communities with limited literacy, creating systems for transmitting knowledge, values, and cultural identity across generations. Elders who remembered traditional songs, stories, and customs played important roles as cultural preservers, teaching younger people the traditions that define their community's identity. This oral tradition created living libraries of cultural knowledge that adapted and evolved while maintaining essential connections to the past. Leisure activities in medieval villages had to fit around the demanding schedules of agricultural work, but communities found ways to incorporate entertainment and relaxation into daily life through work traditions that combined necessary tasks with social interaction. Communal work parties for major projects like barn raising, harvest activities, or craft production often included elements of competition, cooperation, and celebration that made necessary work more enjoyable while strengthening community relationships. Even routine activities like food preparation, textile production, or equipment maintenance could become opportunities for socialization when families worked together or neighbors gathered to help with large projects. These work-based social activities provided regular opportunities for community interaction, while ensuring that essential tasks were completed efficiently. The combination of work and socialization helped create the community spirit that made village life sustainable and meaningful despite its many challenges. The social world of medieval villages was complex, dynamic, and remarkably sophisticated, requiring ordinary people to develop skills in diplomacy, conflict resolution, cultural preservation, and community organization that would challenge even modern professionals. Understanding these social relationships reveals that medieval villagers weren't simple farmers living isolated rural lives, but members of vibrant communities that created rich traditions of cooperation, celebration, and mutual support that sustained human civilization through challenging times while providing models of community life that offer valuable lessons for our own efforts to build strong, resilient societies. While the rich tapestry of medieval village life included celebrations, cooperation, and meaningful community bonds, it would be incomplete to ignore the darker threads woven throughout this existence. Behind the seasonal festivals and harvest celebrations lay a constant undercurrent of vulnerability that shaped every aspect of peasant life. Medieval villagers lived perpetually on the edge of disaster, where a single failed harvest, an outbreak of disease, or the arrival of armed raiders could transform thriving communities into scenes of desperation and suffering. Understanding these challenges reveals the true resilience of medieval people and helps us appreciate why community bonds were so essential to survival. These weren't just social preferences, but practical necessities born from the harsh reality that individual families, no matter how hard-working or resourceful, could not survive alone against the forces that regularly threatened medieval life. The very strength of village communities emerged directly from their shared vulnerability to catastrophes that could strike without warning and devastate entire regions. Medieval peasants lived in intimate relationships with the natural world, but this closeness meant they were completely at the mercy of environmental forces beyond their control. While good weather and favourable growing conditions brought prosperity and celebration, environmental disasters could destroy years of careful work in a matter of days or weeks. The agricultural foundation that supported all village life remained constantly vulnerable to the whims of weather, disease, and natural catastrophe. Crop failures represented the most immediate and devastating threat to village survival. A single season of poor weather could reduce harvest yields so severely that families faced starvation before the next growing season. Medieval agriculture operated with such narrow margins that even modest reductions in crop production created serious hardship, while major failures spelled disaster for entire communities. Villagers learned to read weather signs with desperate intensity, knowing that subtle changes in wind patterns, cloud formations, or seasonal timing could mean the difference between plenty and famine. The causes of crop failure were numerous and often unpredictable. Late spring frosts could kill young plants just as they emerge from the soil, destroying weeks of careful planting work in a single night. Extended droughts withered crops in the fields, leaving families to watch helplessly as their food supply literally dried up before their eyes. Excessive rainfall could be equally destructive, rotting grain in the fields or preventing harvest work during the critical weeks when crops needed to be gathered and stored. Plant diseases posed another constant threat that medieval farmers had little ability to understand or combat. Mysterious blights could spread through grain fields like wildfire, turning healthy crops into blackened stalks within days. Ergot fungus infected rye crops with a toxin that caused horrific symptoms in people who ate contaminated bread, including hallucinations, convulsions, and often death. Villagers had no way to predict or prevent these agricultural diseases, leaving them helpless against threats they could neither see nor understand. Insect infestations could destroy entire harvests with devastating efficiency. Swarms of locusts might descend on villages like biblical plagues, stripping fields bare in hours and leaving communities facing immediate starvation. Other pests worked more slowly but with equal devastation. As weevils infested stored grain, mice and rats consumed precious food supplies, and various insects damaged crops throughout the growing season. Villages developed numerous methods for controlling pests, but these traditional techniques often proved inadequate against major infestations. Weather extremes created challenges that extended far beyond simple crop failures. Severe winters could kill livestock that families depended on for milk, meat, and labour, while also consuming fuel supplies faster than they could be replenished. Families might burn furniture, parts of their houses, or any combustible material they could find, gradually destroying their homes in desperate attempts to stay warm. Extreme cold also made travel dangerous or impossible, cutting villages off from external aid when they needed it most. Summer heat waves brought different but equally serious problems. Livestock suffered in extreme temperatures, reducing milk production and causing animals to die from heat stress. Wells and streams might dry up, forcing villagers to travel dangerous distances for water or to ration their supplies so severely that proper cooking and hygiene became impossible. Hot, dry conditions also increased fire risks, creating constant anxiety about the safety of thatched roofs and wooden buildings. Flooding represented one of the most destructive natural disasters that medieval villages faced. Spring floods caused by rapid snowmelt or heavy rains could wash away entire communities in a matter of hours. Rivers that normally provided water and power for mills could become raging torrents that destroyed bridges, mills, houses, and stored food supplies. Families might lose everything they owned in a single flood, including the tools and seeds they needed to restart their lives. Even minor flooding could have serious consequences for village life. Waterlogged fields prevented planting or harvest work during critical seasons. Damp conditions in houses and storage areas led to rapid spoilage of food supplies and increased the spread of diseases. Flood damage to mills and other essential facilities could deprive entire communities of basic services for months while repairs were made, if they could be made at all. Epidemic diseases struck medieval villages with terrifying regularity, spreading rapidly through communities where people lived in close contact with each other and had little understanding of disease transmission. The Black Death of the 14th century was only the most famous of many epidemics that devastated European villages. Outbreaks of plague, influenza, typhus, dysentery, and other diseases regularly swept through communities, sometimes killing half or more of the population within a few months. The impact of epidemics extended far beyond the immediate deaths they caused. Illness struck randomly, often affecting the healthiest and most productive members of communities. Villages might lose their most skilled craftsmen, their political leaders, or the young adults who performed the heaviest agricultural work. The disruption to normal community functioning could persist long after the disease itself had passed, as survivors struggled to maintain essential activities with reduced populations and disrupted social structures. Disease outbreaks also created psychological trauma that affected entire communities. Watching friends, family members, and neighbours sicken and die from mysterious illnesses generated fear and despair that could paralyse normal community activities. Religious explanations for disease often emphasised divine punishment for sin, creating additional psychological burdens as communities struggled to understand why they were suffering and what they might have done to deserve such catastrophes. Fire posed a constant threat to medieval villages where wooden buildings with thatched roofs stood close together and open flames provided the only sources of heat and light. A single, carelessly tended fire could quickly spread to consume entire neighbourhoods or whole villages. Unlike modern fires that can be controlled with advanced firefighting equipment, Medieval blazes often burned until they ran out of fuel or were stopped by natural barriers like rivers or areas of bare ground. The speed with which fires could spread in medieval villages was terrifying to contemporary observers. Thatched roofs provided excellent fuel that could ignite quickly and burn intensely. Wind could carry burning materials to adjacent buildings, spreading fires faster than people could respond. Within hours, a small cooking fire or poorly maintained hearth could destroy homes that families had spent years building, and all the possessions they had accumulated over lifetimes of work. Forest fires posed additional threats to villages located near wooded areas. During dry periods, fires that started from lightning strikes or human carelessness could burn vast areas of woodland, destroying the timber resources that villages depended on for construction, fuel, and various forest products. Smoke from large fires could also affect air quality over wide areas, causing breathing problems and making outdoor work difficult or dangerous. Environmental degradation developed slowly but could eventually undermine entire village economies. Overuse of agricultural land without adequate crop rotation or fertilization gradually reduced soil fertility, leading to declining harvests even in years with favorable weather. Deforestation around villages could eliminate fuel supplies and building materials, while also affecting local weather patterns and water retention in the soil. Overgrazing of common pastures could destroy grasslands that communities depended on for livestock feed, forcing difficult choices about reducing animal populations or finding alternative pasture areas. Villages also faced problems with soil erosion, particularly on hillsides where agricultural use removed protective vegetation. These environmental problems developed over years or decades, making them difficult for villagers to recognize and address before serious damage had occurred. Water sources could become contaminated or depleted through overuse or environmental changes. Wells might dry up during drought periods or become polluted by agricultural runoff or human waste. Rivers and streams could change course due to flooding or other natural processes, leaving villages without access to the water sources they had always depended on. Finding and developing new water sources required substantial community effort and resources that struggling villages might not be able to provide. While natural disasters presented serious challenges to medieval village life, human-caused threats often proved even more devastating and unpredictable. Unlike environmental hazards that followed seasonal patterns or natural cycles, human predators and political conflicts could strike at any time and often showed deliberate cruelty that made their impact particularly traumatic for village communities. Warfare represented the most systematic and destructive human threat that medieval villagers faced. When armies moved through the countryside, they typically lived off the land by taking whatever they needed from local villages, regardless of whether the communities supported their cause or opposed it. Professional soldiers and armed mercenaries often saw village raids as legitimate ways to supply their forces while weakening enemy territories, making peasant communities targets regardless of their political loyalties. The approach of armies created terror in village communities that had learned from bitter experience what military forces could do to civilian populations. Stories spread quickly about villages that had been completely destroyed, their populations killed or scattered, their food stores consumed and their buildings burned. Even friendly armies posed serious threats to village welfare, as they might consume months of stored food supplies in a few days, leaving communities to face starvation long before the next harvest. Military conflicts also disrupted agricultural cycles in ways that could cause problems lasting for years. Armies might arrive during planting season, preventing villagers from putting in their crops or trampling newly planted fields with cavalry and baggage trains. Harvest season raids could destroy or steal crops just as they were ready for collection, eliminating entire years of agricultural work. Military campaigns that continued for months or years could prevent normal farming activities over large areas, creating widespread food shortages that affected both rural and urban populations. The conduct of medieval warfare often deliberately targeted civilian populations as a military strategy. Destroying enemy agricultural resources and terrorizing rural communities could force opposing rulers to divert military resources to protect their territories, or could pressure them to negotiate by demonstrating the costs of continued conflict. This strategic use of violence against civilian populations meant that villagers often found themselves targeted, not because of anything they had done, but simply because harming them might provide military advantages to their attackers. Siege warfare created particularly difficult conditions for villages located near important castles or fortified towns. Attacking forces might establish camps in the surrounding countryside for months, living off local agricultural production while cutting off trade and normal economic activities. Villages near besieged fortifications often found themselves caught between opposing forces, facing demands for support from both sides while being unable to maintain normal productive activities. Even after military campaigns ended, their effects on village communities could persist for years. Destroyed buildings had to be rebuilt with resources that communities might not possess. Agricultural equipment that had been taken or destroyed needed to be replaced before normal farming could resume. Livestock that had been killed or stolen required time to replenish through breeding programs that could take several years to restore village herds to previous levels. Banditry posed a more localized but equally serious threat to village security and economic welfare. Unlike military forces that might pass through an area relatively quickly, bandit groups often established themselves in particular regions where they could prey on local communities over extended periods. These criminals typically targeted travelers, merchant caravans, and isolated villages, stealing whatever they could carry while often killing or injuring anyone who resisted their demands. The impact of banditry extended far beyond the immediate losses caused by raids and theft. Communities that were frequently attacked by bandits found it difficult to maintain normal economic activities, as travel to markets became dangerous and trade relationships with neighbouring areas were disrupted. Merchants and craftsmen might avoid regions known to be infested with bandits, depriving villages of essential goods and services that could only be obtained through trade with outside communities. Bandit groups often developed detailed knowledge of local communities that made their raids particularly effective and damaging. They learned about seasonal patterns of agricultural work, market days when people carried money, and times when villages might be vulnerable due to harvest activities or religious celebrations. This local knowledge allowed bandits to time their attacks for maximum impact, while minimizing their own risks of capture or retaliation. The psychological impact of banditry created constant anxiety in affected communities, as villagers never knew when they might face attacks or what the consequences might be for their families and neighbours. Fear of bandits could alter daily routines, limit travel, and create suspicion of strangers that disrupted normal social and economic interactions. Communities might invest substantial resources in defensive measures that diverted labour and materials from productive activities. Legal predators within the formal justice system could exploit village communities through corrupt practices that were difficult for ordinary peasants to resist or challenge. Local officials might demand bribes for performing routine administrative functions, impose excessive fines for minor infractions, or use their authority to seize property for personal benefit. These abuses were particularly devastating because they came from the very institutions that were supposed to provide protection and justice for village communities. Taxation and economic exploitation by higher authorities created ongoing burdens that could push village communities toward destitution even during periods without specific disasters. Lords' churches and royal governments all had claims on village production that had to be satisfied regardless of local economic conditions. During difficult years when harvests were poor or other problems reduced village resources, these external obligations remained unchanged, forcing communities to choose between meeting their legal obligations and maintaining adequate food supplies for survival. The timing of tax collection often made these burdens particularly difficult for village communities to bear. Taxes were typically due shortly after harvest, when families were trying to preserve enough food to last through the winter and into the next growing season. Having to surrender substantial portions of their harvest to tax collectors could leave villages without adequate food reserves, making them vulnerable to starvation if other problems developed during the winter months. Some forms of economic exploitation took advantage of villagers' lack of legal knowledge or their inability to challenge official decisions. Land seizures based on questionable legal claims, forced labour obligations beyond traditional requirements, and manipulation of weights and measures in market transactions all represented ways that various authorities could extract additional value from village production without providing corresponding benefits to local communities. Social upheaval and revolutionary movements, while often motivated by legitimate grievances about exploitation and injustice, could create chaos that was devastating for village communities, regardless of their sympathies for the underlying causes. Peasant revolts typically involved violence that disrupted normal economic activities, damaged property, and sometimes resulted in brutal retaliation by authorities seeking to restore order and punish rebel communities. The unpredictability of social conflicts made them particularly difficult for village communities to navigate successfully. Villagers might face demands for support from rebel groups while simultaneously being threatened with punishment by official authorities for any assistance provided to rebels. Communities that tried to remain neutral often found themselves suspected by both sides and vulnerable to attack from either rebels or government forces. Revolutionary periods often saw the breakdown of normal legal and administrative systems that villages depended on for resolving disputes, enforcing contracts, and maintaining basic social order. When established authorities lost control of local situations, violence and lawlessness could flourish as various groups competed for power and resources. Even villages that had no direct involvement in political conflicts could suffer from the general breakdown of public order that accompanied major social upheavals. When disasters struck medieval villages, whether natural or human-caused, survival depended primarily on the strength of community bonds and the effectiveness of mutual aid systems that had been developed through generations of shared hardship. These weren't formal institutions with written rules and official administrators, but rather informal networks of obligation and assistance that activated automatically whenever community members faced serious threats to their welfare. The principle underlying all village mutual aid was simple but profound. Individual families could not survive major disasters alone, but communities working together could overcome challenges that would destroy isolated households. This understanding shaped every aspect of village social organization, from daily work arrangements to marriage customs to religious observances, creating a comprehensive framework for collective survival that distinguished medieval village life from more individualistic social arrangements. Food sharing represented the most critical form of mutual aid that villages practiced, particularly during times of scarcity when some families faced starvation, while others still had adequate supplies. These sharing arrangements weren't charity in the modern sense of voluntary assistance to the unfortunate, but rather systematic resource pooling that recognized community survival as a collective responsibility that benefited everyone by ensuring that temporary hardships didn't permanently damage the village's human resources. During famine periods, villages typically implemented formal rationing systems that distributed available food according to need and family size rather than individual ownership or purchasing power. Families with larger food stores were expected to share with neighbors who faced immediate starvation, with the understanding that such assistance would be reciprocated when circumstances changed. These arrangements required careful monitoring to ensure fairness and to prevent hoarding that could undermine community solidarity during critical periods. Community food storage systems provided another layer of protection against seasonal shortages and emergency situations. Villages often maintained common granaries where families contributed portions of their harvest to create reserves that could be distributed during difficult periods. These collective food stores were carefully managed by trusted community members who ensured that contributions were fair and that distribution served genuine community needs rather than individual preferences. Resource pooling extended beyond food to include sharing of tools, equipment, and labor during times when individual families lacked the means to maintain normal productive activities. Families whose draft animals had died might receive assistance from neighbors who provided plowing services, while those who had lost tools or equipment could borrow replacements until they could obtain their own. This systematic sharing of productive resources helped prevent temporary setbacks from becoming permanent impediments to family welfare. Labor sharing arrangements allowed communities to mobilize their human resources efficiently during emergencies that required coordinated responses. When houses needed to be rebuilt after fires or storms, entire villages might contribute labor to help affected families restore their homes. During harvest seasons, complicated by weather problems or other difficulties, communities could organize collective work efforts that ensured crops were gathered efficiently, despite challenging conditions. The effectiveness of village mutual aid systems depended heavily on reciprocal obligations that bound community members together through networks of mutual dependence. Families who received assistance during difficult periods were expected to provide equivalent help to others when circumstances permitted, creating ongoing relationships that strengthened community bonds while ensuring that aid systems remained sustainable over time. These reciprocal arrangements required sophisticated systems for tracking contributions and obligations that operated largely through community memory and social pressure rather than written records. Village communities developed detailed knowledge about who had provided assistance to whom and under what circumstances, creating informal accounting systems that ensured fairness while maintaining the personal relationships that made mutual aid effective and sustainable. Migration and population movement represented another important survival strategy that medieval villages employed when local conditions became too difficult to support existing populations. These movements weren't random dispersals of desperate people, but rather organized relocations that maintained family and community connections. while seeking better opportunities or escaping specific threats that had made previous locations uninhabitable. Seasonal migration patterns allowed communities to adapt to changing economic conditions by temporarily relocating portions of their population to areas where work was available or where resources were more abundant. Young adults might travel to other regions during certain times of year to work in harvest activities, construction projects, or other temporary employment that provided income for their home communities while reducing local food requirements. Permanent migration often involved entire extended families or even whole village communities that relocated together to maintain their social relationships while escaping problems that had made their previous locations unsustainable. These group migrations helped preserve cultural traditions and mutual aid networks that would have been lost if families had scattered individually to different destinations. The success of migration as a survival strategy depended largely on maintaining connections with established communities that could provide information about opportunities, assistance during travel, and support during the difficult period of establishing new homes and livelihoods. Villages often maintained relationships with communities in other regions through trade connections, religious networks, or family relationships that had developed over generations. Resistance tactics and collective action provided ways for village communities to protect themselves against human predators and exploitative authorities who threatened community welfare. These resistance efforts range from passive non-cooperation to active rebellion, depending on the nature of the threats communities faced and their assessment of what strategies might be effective without provoking retaliation that could make their situations worse. Passive resistance often involved collective non-compliance with demands that communities considered unreasonable or impossible to fulfill. Villages might delay tax payments, provide minimum rather than maximum cooperation with labor obligations, or fail to report information that authorities wanted to use against community interests. This type of resistance required careful coordination to ensure that entire communities participated, and that no individual families were singled out for punishment. Active resistance could involve physical confrontation with bandits, corrupt officials, or other threats that couldn't be addressed through legal channels. Villages might organize armed patrols to protect against bandit raids, collectively refuse to pay excessive taxes or fines, or even participate in broader rebellions against authorities who had seriously abused their power. These more aggressive forms of resistance carried significant risks, but communities sometimes concluded that the dangers of passive acceptance were greater than the risks of active opposition. The effectiveness of resistance activities depended heavily on community solidarity and the ability to maintain unity in the face of external pressure. Authorities often tried to break resistance movements by offering rewards to individuals who would abandon collective action or by threatening harsh punishment for communities that continued to oppose official demands. Villages that successfully resisted exploitation typically had strong leadership and well-developed traditions of collective decision-making that enabled them to maintain unity under pressure. Cultural adaptation and innovation allowed village communities to develop new strategies for dealing with challenges that traditional approaches couldn't address effectively. These adaptations might involve adopting new agricultural techniques that provided better yields or greater resistance to environmental problems, developing new forms of social organization that improved community coordination, or creating new economic activities that reduced dependence on vulnerable agricultural production. Innovation in medieval villages typically built upon existing knowledge and practices rather than representing completely new departures from traditional approaches. Villagers might modify traditional crop rotation systems to address soil problems, adapt building techniques to provide better protection against specific environmental threats, or develop new forms of craft production that took advantage of available resources while providing alternative sources of income. The process of cultural adaptation was usually gradual and collective, involving community discussion and experimentation, rather than sudden changes imposed by individual decision-makers. Villagers needed to maintain enough continuity with traditional practices to preserve valuable knowledge, while adapting enough to address new challenges that traditional approaches couldn't handle effectively. The true measure of medieval village resilience wasn't their ability to avoid disasters, since many catastrophes were simply unavoidable, given the technological and social limitations of the period. Instead, their strength lay in their capacity to recover from devastating setbacks and to incorporate lessons learned from crisis experiences into improved systems for preventing or surviving future disasters. Recovery from major catastrophes required careful planning and sustained effort over periods that often extended for years or even decades. Villages that had suffered extensive damage needed to prioritize their rebuilding efforts to restore essential functions first, then gradually expand their activities as resources and population allowed. This process required sophisticated understanding of what elements were most critical to community survival and what could be temporarily postponed while more urgent needs were addressed. Rebuilding efforts typically began with restoring basic shelter and food production capabilities that were essential for immediate survival. Families who had lost their homes needed temporary housing while they worked to construct new permanent dwellings. Agricultural activities had to be resumed as quickly as possible to prevent further food shortages that could compound the problems created by the original disaster. The allocation of resources during rebuilding periods required careful community coordination to ensure that assistance went to those who needed it most, while maintaining the productive capacity that would be needed for long-term recovery. Communities had to balance immediate humanitarian needs against investment in infrastructure and equipment that would be essential for future prosperity, but didn't provide immediate relief for current suffering. Labor allocation during recovery periods involved mobilizing community members efficiently, while recognizing that people who had suffered losses might need time to recover psychologically as well as materially from their experiences. Villages needed to maintain morale and community spirit during difficult rebuilding periods when progress might be slow and setbacks were common. Population recovery mechanisms helped communities restore their demographic strength. After disasters that had caused significant mortality or out-migration, villages actively encouraged immigration from other areas, arranged marriages that would bring new families into the community, and provided incentives for young adults to remain in the village rather than seeking opportunities elsewhere. Marriage policies during recovery periods often emphasized bringing new people into the community, rather than maintaining traditional patterns that might limit population growth. Villages might relax normal restrictions on marriages between social groups, encourage marriages with immigrants from other areas, or provide economic incentives for young couples to establish households in the recovering community. Immigration encouragement involved active recruitment of families from other areas who possessed skills or resources that the recovering village needed. Communities might offer land grants, housing assistance, or other incentives to attract specific types of immigrants, such as skilled craftsmen whose expertise would be valuable for rebuilding efforts or farming families who could help restore agricultural production. Economic restructuring often became necessary when disasters had destroyed traditional sources of livelihood or when recovery required different types of economic activities than had previously supported the community. Villages might need to develop new crafts or trades, establish different relationships with external markets, or modify their agricultural practices to address problems that had contributed to their earlier difficulties. Diversification of economic activities helped communities become less vulnerable to specific types of disasters that had caused previous problems. Villages that had depended too heavily on single crops might introduce new agricultural products that provided better protection against weather problems or plant diseases. Communities might develop craft production or other economic activities that provided alternative sources of income when agricultural production was insufficient. Market relationship changes could help communities establish more reliable access to essential goods or services that they couldn't produce locally. Villages might develop new trade connections that provided better prices for their products or more dependable supplies of materials they needed to import. These relationship changes often required considerable time and effort to establish, but could provide important protection against future disruptions. Cultural preservation and transmission became especially important during recovery periods, when communities needed to maintain their identity and traditional knowledge while adapting to changed circumstances. Villages worked to preserve essential cultural practices, religious observances, and traditional knowledge that defined their community character and provided guidance for dealing with various challenges. Oral tradition preservation ensured that knowledge about previous disasters and successful survival strategies would be available to future generations who might face similar challenges. Communities developed stories, songs, and other cultural forms that preserved practical information about crisis management, while also maintaining the social bonds that held villages together during difficult periods. Religious and ceremonial practices often incorporated acknowledgement of disaster experiences and community recovery efforts, creating ongoing reminders of both vulnerability and resilience that helped prepare villages for future challenges. These practices reinforced community solidarity while preserving collective memory about effective responses to various types of crises. Learning from crisis experiences allowed villages to develop improved strategies for preventing, managing, or recovering from similar disasters in the future. This learning process involved careful analysis of what had worked well during previous crises, what had failed, and what might be done differently to achieve better outcomes when similar challenges arose. Disaster preparedness improvements might include better food storage systems, improved building techniques that provided better protection against fire or weather damage, or enhanced early warning systems that gave communities more time to respond effectively to approaching threats. These improvements typically represented gradual refinements of existing practices rather than revolutionary changes to traditional approaches. Social organization modifications could improve community coordination during emergencies while maintaining the flexibility needed for normal community functioning. Villages might develop clearer leadership structures for crisis situations, establish better communication systems for coordinating community responses, or create formal procedures for making collective decisions quickly when rapid action was required. The accumulated wisdom that medieval villages developed through their experiences with disasters created remarkably resilient communities that could survive catastrophes that would destroy less cohesive social groups. Their success depended not on avoiding all threats, which was impossible given their circumstances, but on creating social systems that could mobilize collective resources effectively, maintain community solidarity under pressure, and adapt continuously to changing challenges while preserving essential cultural knowledge. This hard-won expertise in community survival represents one of the most valuable legacies of medieval village life, demonstrating human capacity for cooperation, resilience, and adaptation under conditions of constant uncertainty and periodic crisis. The village communities that emerged from centuries of shared struggle had learned lessons about collective survival that remain relevant for any society facing serious challenges to its stability and prosperity. Understanding these darker aspects of medieval village life doesn't diminish appreciation for the achievements of these communities, but rather enhances recognition of what they accomplished despite facing challenges that would test any society's resilience and adaptability. Their success in creating sustainable, meaningful communities under such difficult conditions provides inspiration and practical guidance for modern efforts to build societies capable of thriving despite uncertainty and periodic setbacks. The medieval villages we've explored, with their careful agricultural cycles, intricate social bonds, and deep spiritual rhythms, didn't appear overnight, nor did they remain unchanged through the centuries. The story of how village life evolved from the collapse of the Roman Empire to the dawn of the modern age reveals one of history's most remarkable transformations. How ordinary people gradually rebuilt civilization from the ground up, creating new ways of living that would endure for nearly 1,000 years. Understanding this evolution helps us appreciate that medieval village life wasn't a static period of darkness, but rather a dynamic era of constant adaptation, innovation, and growth. The villagers we've come to know, those who wove their own cloth, celebrated seasonal festivals, and built communities that could survive plague and famine, were the inheritors of centuries of gradual change that transformed Europe from a collection of crumbling Roman territories into a network of thriving rural communities. When the last Roman legions withdrew from their frontier posts in the 5th century, they left behind a world in transition. The great Roman cities, once bustling centres of trade and administration, slowly emptied as people scattered to the countryside seeking safety and survival. The elaborate Roman infrastructure, roads, aqueducts, administrative systems, gradually crumbled without the central authority to maintain them. Yet from this apparent collapse emerged something entirely new: the medieval village. The transformation didn't happen overnight. In the early medieval period, roughly from 500 to 1000 CE, European society underwent a fundamental reorganization that would shape the next millennium. The survivors of Roman collapse faced a crucial question: how do you rebuild civilization when the old systems no longer work? The answer lay not in trying to recreate the Roman world, but in developing entirely new approaches to community, agriculture, and social organization. The earliest medieval settlements bore little resemblance to the organized villages we've explored in previous chapters. These were often temporary communities, groups of families who banded together for mutual protection, cleared patches of forest for farming, and built simple wooden structures that could be abandoned if danger threatened. Life was precarious, uncertain, and often violent, as various Germanic tribes, local strongmen, and remnants of Roman authority competed for control over territories and populations. Yet even in these challenging circumstances, the seeds of future village prosperity were being planted. The collapse of Roman slave-based agriculture forced communities to develop new agricultural techniques based on free peasant labour. Families who had once been dependent on distant markets learned to produce everything they needed locally. Communities that had relied on Roman law and administration began creating their own systems of governance and dispute resolution. The most significant development during this early period was the gradual establishment of what would become the manorial system. As powerful warriors carved out territories and offered protection to local populations, the foundation was laid for the lord-peasant relationships that would define medieval village life. These weren't yet the sophisticated manorial structures we've examined, but rather rough agreements where communities accepted the authority of local strongmen in exchange for protection against raiders and invaders. Agricultural innovation during this period focused on survival and adaptation to local conditions. Roman farming methods designed for large estates worked by slaves proved unsuitable for small family farms operated by free peasants. Communities experimented with new crops, developed better tools for clearing forests, and began the long process of learning how to maintain soil fertility without the elaborate Roman systems of fertilization and crop rotation. The Christianization of rural populations represented another crucial transformation during these early centuries. As the Roman Empire had adopted Christianity in its final period, the new faith gradually spread throughout the countryside, but it had to adapt to rural realities very different from urban Christian communities. Village Christianity blended Christian teachings with older agricultural traditions, creating the rich religious calendar we've explored, where Christian holy days aligned with seasonal farming activities and ancient fertility rituals found new meaning within Christian symbolism. The establishment of village churches during this period wasn't just a religious development, but a crucial step in community organization. Churches provided not only spiritual centers, but also focal points for community gathering, decision-making, and cultural preservation. The village priest often served as the only literate person in the community, making churches repositories of knowledge and connections to the broader Christian world. By the end of this early period, around 1000 CE, the basic framework of medieval village life was in place. Communities had learned to organize themselves around seasonal agricultural cycles, had developed systems of mutual aid and cooperative labor, and had created social hierarchies that balanced individual needs with collective survival. The stage was set for the remarkable expansion and prosperity that would characterize the High Middle Ages. If the early medieval period was about survival and basic organization, the High Middle Ages, roughly from 1000 to 1300 CE, represented the flowering of medieval village life. This was the era when all the systems we've explored reached their fullest development. Sophisticated agriculture, rich religious traditions, complex social relationships, and remarkable community resilience. Understanding this period helps us appreciate why medieval village life proved so successful and enduring. The most dramatic change during this period was unprecedented population growth. Europe's population roughly doubled between 1000 and 1300, from perhaps 40 million to nearly 80 million people. This wasn't just a statistical increase. It represented a fundamental transformation in how people lived, worked, and thought about the future. For the first time since the fall of Rome, Europeans could expect their children to live better lives than they had, could invest in long-term projects, and could support specialized activities beyond basic survival. This population growth was both cause and effect of remarkable agricultural improvements. The three-field system of crop rotation, which we've explored in detail, reached its most sophisticated development during this period. Villages perfected techniques for maintaining soil fertility, maximizing yields, and managing agricultural labor that allowed them to support much larger populations from the same amount of land. The agricultural innovations of this period went far beyond farming techniques. Villages invested in infrastructure that would have seemed impossible in earlier centuries. Water-powered mills that could grind grain more efficiently than human labor, elaborate irrigation systems that brought water to previously unusable land, and storage facilities that could preserve food through multiple years of poor harvests. These improvements required substantial community cooperation and long-term planning, possible only in societies confident about their future. Land clearance during this period transformed the European landscape. Villages organized massive cooperative projects to clear forests, drain swamps, and bring new land under cultivation. Entire new villages were established in previously uninhabited areas, often following carefully planned layouts that reflected centuries of learning about optimal village organization. This expansion wasn't random, but followed sophisticated strategies for site selection, resource management, and community planning. The development of markets and trade networks during this period connected villages to the broader European economy, in ways that enhanced rather than undermined their self-sufficiency. Villages could now specialize in producing certain goods, high-quality wool, fine pottery, specialized agricultural products, while trading for items they couldn't produce locally. This trade relationship strengthened village economies by providing additional income sources while maintaining the local production capabilities that ensured survival during difficult times. Social stratification within villages became more complex during this period, but also more fluid. While the basic hierarchy of lords, free peasants, villeins, and serfs remained, there were more opportunities for families to improve their status through successful farming, craft production, or service to the lord. Wealthy peasant families could accumulate substantial property and influence, while skilled craftsmen could achieve status that rivaled that of some minor nobility. The High Middle Ages also saw the full development of the rich religious and cultural life we've explored in previous chapters. Village churches built during this period often replaced earlier wooden structures with stone buildings that demonstrated both community prosperity and religious devotion. The elaborate religious calendar, seasonal festivals, and integration of Christian and agricultural traditions reached their most sophisticated development. Cultural achievements during this period included the preservation and development of oral traditions that connected villages to their historical past, while adapting to changing circumstances. The storytelling, music, and folk traditions that we've examined flourished during this era of prosperity and confidence. Villages had both the leisure time for cultural activities and the social stability necessary for long-term cultural preservation. Technological innovation accelerated during the High Middle Ages, often originating in village workshops and agricultural experiments. Improvements in plough design, the development of the heavy-wheeled plough, advances in metalworking and tool production, and innovations in building techniques all emerged from the practical problem-solving of village communities. These innovations spread through informal networks of communication and trade, gradually improving agricultural productivity and quality of life throughout Europe. The legal and administrative systems governing village life also reached their most sophisticated development during this period. The manor courts we've explored operated according to well-established procedures that balanced local customs with broader legal principles. Village assemblies developed effective methods for community decision-making that could handle increasingly complex issues of resource management, trade relationships, and social organization. By 1300, medieval village life had achieved a remarkable synthesis of prosperity, stability, and cultural richness. Villages had learned to support larger populations while maintaining environmental sustainability, had developed social systems that balanced individual opportunity with collective welfare, and had created cultural traditions that provided meaning and continuity across generations. This achievement represented the culmination of centuries of gradual development and practical wisdom. The late medieval period, from roughly 1300 to 1500 CE, tested every aspect of village life that had developed over the previous centuries. This was an era of unprecedented challenges, demographic crisis, climate change, economic disruption, and social upheaval that forced villages to adapt or perish. Yet rather than destroying medieval village life, these challenges ultimately transformed it, creating new forms of community organization that would influence European development for centuries to come. The Great Famine of 1315-1322 announced the end of the high medieval expansion period with devastating clarity. Years of excessive rain destroyed crops across northern Europe, leading to widespread starvation that killed millions and fundamentally altered how villagers thought about agricultural planning and food security. This wasn't just a temporary setback, but a warning that the agricultural systems that had supported population growth for 3 centuries were reaching their limits. The Black Death, arriving in Europe around 1347, delivered an even more devastating blow to village communities. This plague pandemic killed an estimated 1/3 of Europe's population within just a few years, fundamentally altering village social structures, economic relationships, and cultural assumptions. Entire villages were abandoned, agricultural land returned to wilderness, and the social relationships that had governed rural life for centuries were turned upside down. Yet villages that survived these catastrophes often emerged stronger and more adaptable than before. The massive population decline meant that surviving villagers had access to better land, could demand higher wages for their labor, and possessed more bargaining power in their relationships with lords and employers. The rigid social hierarchies that had characterized earlier village life began to break down, replaced by more flexible arrangements based on economic necessity rather than traditional obligations. Agricultural practices adapted to the new realities of reduced population and climate change. Villages experimented with new crops that were more resistant to harsh weather, developed improved techniques for soil management, that could maintain productivity with less labour, and created more efficient systems for food storage and preservation. The agricultural innovations of this period often proved more sustainable than the intensive techniques of the High Middle Ages. The labour shortage created by demographic collapse transformed village social relationships in fundamental ways. Peasants who had been bound to the land through serfdom found themselves in demand as free labourers who could negotiate the terms of their employment. Villages competed to attract and retain workers by offering better conditions, higher wages, and greater personal freedom. This transformation accelerated the gradual disappearance of serfdom throughout much of Western Europe. Economic relationships between villages and the broader European economy also changed during this period. The disruption of traditional trade routes and the decline of many urban centres forced villages to become more self-sufficient, while also creating new opportunities for local and regional commerce. Villages that could adapt to these changing economic conditions often prospered, while those that clung to outdated methods struggled to survive. Peasant revolts during this period, the English Peasants' Revolt of 1381, the French Jacquerie, various uprisings in Germany and other regions, reflected both the growing confidence of village communities and their willingness to challenge traditional authorities when circumstances demanded change. These revolts weren't simply expressions of desperation, but organised political movements that demonstrated the sophisticated leadership and communication capabilities that village communities had developed. Religious life in villages also adapted to the challenges of the late medieval period. The massive mortality caused by plague and famine led to increased emphasis on personal piety, devotional practices, and religious movements that spoke directly to the concerns of ordinary people. Villages developed new forms of religious expression that blended traditional Christian teachings with practical wisdom about surviving in an uncertain world. Technological innovation accelerated during this period as villages sought solutions to the challenges of reduced population and changing economic conditions. Improvements in agricultural tools and techniques, advances in building methods that required less labour, and innovations in craft production that increased efficiency all emerged from the practical problem-solving of village communities facing new challenges. The late medieval period also saw significant changes in village governance and social organisation. Traditional manorial structures adapted to new realities of labour shortage and peasant mobility, often evolving into more flexible arrangements that gave village communities greater autonomy in managing their own affairs. Village assemblies gained authority over areas that had previously been controlled by external lords, while new forms of community organisation emerged to address challenges that traditional systems couldn't handle effectively. Cultural changes during this period reflected both the trauma of demographic collapse and the resilience of village communities in preserving essential traditions while adapting to new circumstances. Folk traditions, seasonal celebrations, and oral culture showed remarkable flexibility in maintaining continuity, while incorporating new elements that reflected changing social realities. By 1500, European village life had been fundamentally transformed by 2 centuries of crisis and adaptation. Villages had learned to function with smaller populations, had developed more flexible social and economic arrangements, and had created new forms of community organisation that balanced tradition with innovation. While these changes marked the end of classic medieval village life, they also laid the foundation for the early modern developments that would follow. As the 15th century drew to a close, the medieval villages we've explored throughout this journey were evolving into something new. The communities that had emerged from the crises of the late medieval period bore the essential characteristics of medieval village life: cooperative agriculture, strong social bonds, integration of work and worship, but had adapted these traditions to new circumstances that pointed toward the modern world. The most significant change was the gradual erosion of the manorial system that had provided the framework for medieval village life. While lords and peasants continued to exist, their relationships became increasingly based on economic contracts rather than traditional obligations. Peasants gained greater freedom to move between villages, to choose their occupations, and to negotiate the terms of their labour. This transformation didn't happen overnight, but by 1500 it was clearly underway throughout much of Western Europe. Agricultural practices continued evolving as villages incorporated new crops and techniques that had been introduced during the late medieval period. The potato, various new grains, and improved livestock breeds gradually changed village agricultural systems, while new methods of soil management and crop rotation increased productivity with less labour. These changes laid the groundwork for the agricultural revolution that would transform European farming in subsequent centuries. Trade relationships between villages and urban centres became more sophisticated and reliable as transportation networks improved and commercial law developed. Villages could now depend on regular markets for selling their surplus production and purchasing goods they couldn't produce locally. This increased commercial activity provided new opportunities for village prosperity, while maintaining the local self-sufficiency that had always been essential to rural survival. The printing press, invented around 1450, began to transform village intellectual life by making books and written materials more widely available. While most villagers remained illiterate, the presence of printed materials in churches and manor houses began to supplement the oral traditions that had previously been the primary means of preserving and transmitting knowledge. This technological change would eventually transform village culture, though its full impact wouldn't be felt for several more centuries. Religious changes during this period reflected broader transformations in European Christianity that would culminate in the Protestant Reformation. Village religious life remained deeply traditional, but new devotional practices, increased emphasis on personal piety, and growing criticism of church corruption all prepared rural communities for the religious upheavals of the 16th century. The strong religious foundations of village life proved adaptable to these changing spiritual currents while maintaining their essential character. Social mobility increased significantly during this period as the rigid hierarchies of earlier medieval society gave way to more flexible arrangements based on economic success and personal achievement. Wealthy peasant families could purchase land and achieve status previously reserved for nobility, while skilled craftsmen could establish businesses that provided security and prosperity for their families. This increased social fluidity didn't eliminate social distinctions but made them more permeable and achievement-based. The late medieval period also witnessed the emergence of new forms of village leadership and governance that reflected the increased autonomy and self-confidence of rural communities. Village assemblies gained authority over local affairs, while new positions like village mayors or councils emerged to handle the more complex administrative tasks required by changing economic and social conditions. These developments laid the groundwork for the local self-government that would characterize rural communities in the early modern period. Cultural developments during this transitional period demonstrated the remarkable resilience and adaptability of village traditions. Folk festivals adapted to incorporate new elements while maintaining their essential character. Craft traditions evolved to meet changing market demands while preserving traditional skills, and oral culture continued to flourish even as written materials became more common. This cultural flexibility enabled village communities to maintain their identity while adapting to changing circumstances. By 1500, the transformation from medieval to early modern village life was well underway. The communities that had emerged from centuries of development, crisis, and adaptation retained the essential characteristics that had made medieval village life so successful: strong social bonds, cooperative labour, integration of spiritual and practical life, and remarkable resilience in the face of challenges. Yet they had also developed new capabilities and characteristics that prepared them for the different challenges and opportunities of the modern world. The story of how medieval village life evolved and transformed reveals one of history's most remarkable achievements: the creation of human communities that could adapt to changing circumstances while preserving essential values and traditions. The villagers whose lives we've explored weren't passive victims of historical forces, but active agents who shaped their own destinies through intelligence, cooperation, and persistent effort to create better lives for themselves and their children. Their legacy extends far beyond the rural communities they created. The principles of cooperation, mutual aid, environmental stewardship, and integration of work with meaning that characterize medieval village life offer insights relevant to contemporary challenges of creating sustainable, equitable, and fulfilling communities. The medieval village experiment in human cooperation lasted for nearly 1,000 years and created the foundation for much that we value in Western civilization. The evolution of medieval village life from its origins in post-Roman collapse to its transformation in the early modern period demonstrates humanity's remarkable capacity for adaptation and innovation. These communities faced every challenge that human societies encounter: environmental crisis, demographic collapse, economic disruption, social upheaval, technological change, yet managed not only to survive but to create rich, meaningful, and sustainable ways of life that supported millions of people across centuries of change. Understanding this evolution helps us appreciate both the achievement represented by medieval village life and the lessons it offers for contemporary efforts to create communities that can thrive in an uncertain world. The story of how ordinary people rebuilt civilization through patience, cooperation, and practical wisdom remains one of history's most inspiring examples of human resilience and creativity. Their success in creating sustainable communities offers hope and guidance for our own efforts to build societies that can endure and flourish despite the challenges of an ever-changing world. As we conclude this exploration of medieval village life, we can appreciate that we've witnessed not just a historical curiosity, but a demonstration of fundamental human capacities for cooperation, adaptation, and community building that remain as relevant today as they were 1,000 years ago. The medieval villagers who lived these remarkable lives created something truly extraordinary, proof that ordinary people, working together with wisdom and determination, can build communities that endure and flourish across centuries of change and challenge.